My wife abandoned me when I was diagnosed with cancer at 29. You're too expensive to save, she said, cutting all contact. 5 years later, I survived and worked 3 jobs to pay medical bills. Last week, a lawyer knocked on my door with documents about a $63 million medical research inheritance. He smiled and said, the donor specifically requested, "Look, I'm not saying I believed in fairy tales or anything, but when you're standing at the altar promising someone forever, you kind of assume forever means more than just the good Instagram moments. You know, the whole package, vacations, arguments about whose turn it is to do the dishes, maybe even holding hands during the scary parts. But apparently, when they make you recite those wedding vows about in sickness and in health, there's this invisible asterisk nobody mentions. The one that says terms and conditions apply in font size -12. Mine had a real specific clause tucked away in the fine print. Unless saving you costs more than a mid-range sedan and requires actual emotional labor. I was 29 years old, which is supposed to be this golden age where you're figuring your life out. Maybe buying your first real furniture that doesn't come from IKEA. Possibly considering whether you want kids or just really committed houseplants. Instead, I was sitting in a hospital bed that smelled like industrial-strength bleach and broken dreams, with tubes snaking out of my arms like I was some kind of low-budget science experiment. The foredrip made this rhythmic beeping sound that I'd already started to hate, and the fluorescent lights overhead were doing that flicker thing that makes you feel like you're trapped in a horror movie nobody bothered to give a decent budget. That's when Melissa walked in. My wife. The woman I'd promised my life to approximately 14 months earlier at a ceremony that cost more than my car and featured a 3-tier cake nobody actually liked. She stood at the foot of my bed wearing those designer heels I'd bought her for Christmas. The ones she said made her feel powerful, and honestly, she looked more inconvenienced than concerned. Like she'd just been informed her favorite brunch spot was closed for renovations. Her face had that carefully blank expression people get when they're about to deliver news they've already processed and moved on from, while you're still stuck at the starting line wondering what the hell is happening. I can't do this, she said, and her voice had this practiced quality to it, like she'd rehearsed this speech in the car on the way over, maybe ran through it a couple times in the hospital parking lot to make sure she hit the right notes of sympathy without actually committing to any real emotion. I remember blinking at her, my brain still foggy from whatever cocktail of medications they'd pumped into me that morning, thinking maybe I'd misheard. Maybe the cancer had already spread to my ears. Can't do what? I asked, because apparently even when your life is actively falling apart, you still need clarification on exactly how it's happening. You're too expensive to save, she said, and I swear to God, she said it with the same tone someone uses when they're canceling a streaming service they don't watch anymore. Not Netflix. More like one of those niche channels you subscribed to for one show and forgot about. Clinical. Businesslike. Already decided. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because what else do you do when your wife just put a price tag on your life and apparently you came in under budget for her concern? The laugh came out weird, kind of strangled, and it hurt my chest where they'd been doing tests all morning. I'm sorry, did you just cost-benefit analyze our marriage? Her mother, Darlene, because of course Darlene was there, lurking near the doorway like some kind of designer-clad vulture, stepped forward and nodded with this satisfied expression, like she'd just balanced a checkbook and everything came out neat and tidy. Darlene had never liked me, which I'd known from day one when she asked what my financial prospects were at our engagement dinner. Apparently, graphic designer with student loans wasn't the answer she was hoping for. Now she was standing there radiating vindication, her arms crossed over her Chanel blazer, probably thinking she'd been right about me all along. It's for the best, Darlene said, using that voice people use when they're pretending to be wise but are really just being cruel. You're young, Melissa. You can't throw away your best years on someone who's going to be a financial burden. Financial burden. That's what I'd been reduced to. Not a husband, not a partner, not even a human being fighting for his life. Just a line item on a balance sheet that didn't add up in their favor. Melissa wouldn't even look at me. She studied her manicure instead, those perfectly painted nails I'd watched her get done just last week while I'd sat in the salon's waiting area scrolling through WebMD, trying to convince myself that my symptoms were probably just stress. I'm sorry, she said, But it was the kind of sorry people offer when they bump into you at the grocery store, not when they're abandoning their spouse in a cancer ward. How long have you been planning this? I asked, because some masochistic part of me needed to know. Did you decide in the parking lot? Or was this a conversation you had over coffee this morning? She flinched, just slightly, but didn't answer. Darlene put a hand on her shoulder, protective and possessive, already steering her daughter away from the mess she'd married. We should go, Darlene said. You've said what you came to say. And they left, just like that. Melissa's heels clicked on the tile floor. This sharp, staccato sound that echoed off the walls and seemed to announce my abandonment to the entire ward. Click, 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 each step taking her further away while I sat there connected to machines that beeped out my heartbeat like some kind of sad metronome. The door swung shut with this pneumatic hiss, and suddenly the room felt about 3 times larger and infinitely more empty. I stared at that door for probably 20 minutes, half expecting her to come back, to burst through with tears and apologies, saying she'd panicked, that she didn't mean it, that fear had made her cruel. But the door stayed closed, and the only sound was the 4 drip and the distant murmur of nurses at their station down the hall. That morning, I'd walked into the hospital thinking I'd be dealing with a cancer diagnosis. That seemed like enough, you know? Like that should be the worst thing happening to me on any given Tuesday. But apparently, the universe had looked at my situation and thought, you know what this needs? Let's add some betrayal. Some good, old-fashioned abandonment. Really give this guy a story to tell. So yeah, I wasn't just diagnosed with cancer that day. I was diagnosed with being broke and inconvenient. With being not worth the effort. With being the kind of investment that didn't yield returns, at least not the kind that mattered to the woman who'd promised to love me forever. Turns out forever has a price point, and I'd just discovered I couldn't afford it. I looked down at my left hand, at the wedding ring I was still wearing, because taking it off seemed like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit yet. The gold band caught the fluorescent light, and I thought about how Melissa had slipped it onto my finger just over a year ago, her eyes wet with happy tears, promising me everything while meaning none of it. In sickness and in health, I whispered to the empty room, my voice cracking on the last word. Guess we should have defined our terms. The day after Melissa walked out, I discovered something interesting about hospital ceilings. They're absolutely covered in water stains that look like abstract art if you stare at them long enough. When you've got nothing but time and existential dread, you start seeing patterns. That one up there? Definitely looked like a duck wearing a top hat. That cluster near the corner? Could have been a map of Florida, or maybe just proof that hospital maintenance budgets were as depressed as I was. I counted them like other people count sheep, except instead of falling asleep, I just got better at cataloging my misery in beige and yellow-brown splotches. The nurses had clearly gotten the memo about my situation, because they started tiptoeing around my room like I was made of glass, or worse, like I was contagious with bad luck. They'd slip in to check my vitals with these sympathetic smiles that made me want to throw my Jell-O cup at the wall. Though to be fair, hospital Jell-O isn't really throwable. It just kind of jiggles disapprovingly and stays put. Nobody knew what to say to the guy whose wife had bailed faster than passengers on a sinking ship, so they just said nothing, which somehow felt louder than any conversation could have been. I was in the middle of identifying what I was pretty sure was a water stain shaped like Abraham Lincoln when my door banged open with enough force to make me jump, which hurt because everything hurt, and in walked this woman who clearly hadn't received the "be gentle with the abandoned cancer patient" memo. She was maybe 55, built like someone who'd spent her life pushing back against things that pushed first, wearing a blazer that had seen better days and carrying a binder that looked thick enough to double as a weapon. "You gonna die? Or are you gonna get stubborn?" she asked, not even bothering with pleasantries like "hello," or "how are you feeling," or any of that fake sympathy everyone else was drowning me in. I blinked at her, wondering if the morphine drip had kicked in without me noticing and I was hallucinating confrontational social workers. "I'm sorry, is that an option on some kind of form I need to fill out? Because nobody gave me that paperwork." She laughed, this big, genuine sound that seemed completely out of place in a room that had been nothing but whispers and sad looks for the past 24 hours. "Ruthie Hall," she said, sticking out her hand like we were at a business meeting instead of in a cancer ward where my life was actively imploding. "Social worker, professional pain in the administration's ass, and your new best friend whether you like it or not." I shook her hand weakly, pretty sure I didn't have the energy to resist whatever hurricane had just blown into my room. I don't have any money for whatever you're selling. Good thing I'm not selling anything then, Ruthie said, pulling up the world's most uncomfortable-looking plastic chair and dropping that massive binder on my bed with a thud that made the four-pole rattle. I'm here to make sure you don't die just because your wife has the emotional capacity of a parking meter. I actually laughed at that, which hurt my chest but felt good in a way that nothing had felt good in days. You heard about that, huh? Honey, everyone on this floor heard about that, Ruthie said, flipping open her binder with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Nurses' station gossip travels faster than hospital Wi-Fi, and the Wi-Fi here is terrible, so that's saying something. But forget about her. We've got work to do. She started pulling out papers, forms, pamphlets, printouts that looked like they'd been photocopied so many times the text was starting to blur. Charity programs I'd never heard of. Medical grants I didn't know existed. Financial assistance applications that required more information than my taxes. Payment plans that actually seemed designed for humans instead of trust fund babies. Drug company programs that would cover medications I couldn't pronounce, let alone afford. This, Ruthie said, tapping the binder with one finger, is what I call salvation through paperwork. It's not sexy, it's not fast, and it requires more signatures than a celebrity autograph session, but it works. We're going to apply for every single thing you qualify for, and probably some things you don't, because the worst they can say is no and you're already living through the worst, so what's a few rejection letters? I stared at the mountain of papers that had just taken over my bed, feeling something that might have been hope trying to claw its way through the depression and abandonment. Why are you doing this? Ruthie looked at me over her reading glasses, and her expression softened just a fraction. Because nobody should have to die alone just because they're broke. And because I'm really good at filling out forms and making administrators uncomfortable. It's like therapy, but I get paid for it. That night, after Ruthie had finally left, taking half the binder with her to photocopy in triplicate, because apparently the universe required everything in triplicate. I was lying there trying to process the fact that a complete stranger was fighting harder for my life than my own wife had, when I heard humming. Low, melodic, the kind of humming that came from somewhere deep and genuine. Mr. Amos, the night janitor, was mopping near my door. I'd seen him around for the past few days, but hadn't really registered him as anything more than part of the hospital background noise. Just another person in scrubs pushing cleaning equipment and trying to make everything smell less like sickness and more like industrial lemon. He was older, maybe 60-something, with gray hair and the kind of face that suggested he'd seen pretty much everything and wasn't impressed by most of it. He wasn't talkative, didn't ask me how I was feeling or give me those pitying looks everyone else seemed to have perfected. He just hummed gospel songs. I eventually realized old hymns my grandmother used to play on Sunday mornings when I was a kid. The kind of music that felt like someone wrapping a blanket around your shoulders without asking if you were cold first. I noticed he'd left something on my tray table. A pack of crackers, the cheap kind from the vending machine that cost $1 and tasted like cardboard, had ambitions of being food. At first I thought maybe he'd left them there by accident, or maybe he pitied me the same way everyone else did. But then he did it again the next night. And the night after that. Sometimes crackers, sometimes a granola bar, once an apple that looked like it had been smuggled out of the cafeteria. You don't have to do that, I said one night, my voice rough from not using it much during the day. He paused his mopping, looked at me with these calm eyes that seemed to see right through all the bravado I was trying to maintain. Everybody's gotta eat, he said simply, then went back to humming and pushing his mop across the floor in slow, methodical strokes. That's when I realized it wasn't pity. It was friendship, the quiet kind, the kind that didn't need a lot of words or explanations. The kind that showed up in the form of dollar store crackers and gospel hymns at 2 in the morning when you were lying in the dark wondering if your life was ever going to feel normal again. I had lost a wife, but somehow I'd gained a warrior social worker with a binder thick as a phone book and a janitor who communicated in snacks and spirituals. If this was rock bottom, at least it came with unlikely allies and the distant hope that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I felt. Chemo is a lot like having a jealous ex-girlfriend, except instead of just keying your car and posting vague accusations on social media, it systematically destroys everything you thought you knew about your body while claiming it's doing you a favor. It's violent in this quiet, insidious way, not a punch to the face, but more like someone slowly turning up the gravity until just existing feels like running a marathon through quicksand. And it's messy. Oh God, is it messy, in ways that the pamphlets with their cheerful stock photos of smiling cancer patients definitely don't prepare you for. The unpredictability was somehow the worst part, like living with a ticking time bomb that might go off during breakfast or at 3 in the morning, or while you're trying to have a conversation with a nurse about whether lime jello is actually food or just colored water with trust issues. My hair started leaving before I could even process what was happening, which felt weirdly appropriate considering Melissa had done the exact same thing. Except my hair was less dramatic about it. No speeches about financial burdens or clicking heels, just gradually abandoning ship in clumps that ended up on my pillow, in the shower drain, basically everywhere except actually on my head where it was supposed to be. I woke up one morning looking like a patchy lawn that had given up on life, and by the end of the week, I just had the nurse buzz it all off because pretending I still had hair felt more depressing than just accepting my new aerodynamic reality. At least my hair didn't take the car when it left, which was more than I could say for my ex-wife. So that felt like a minor victory in the world's saddest competition. Ruthie showed up during one of my better days. And by better, I mean I'd only vomited twice instead of my usual 4 times. With news that made me think maybe I'd hallucinated her entire existence. "Got you a job," she announced, dropping another stack of papers on my bed like she was dealing cards in the world's worst poker game. I stared at her, pretty sure the chemo had finally fried the part of my brain that processed reality. I can barely walk to the bathroom without needing a nap. What kind of job could I possibly do? "Remote data entry," she said, completely unfazed by my pessimism, which honestly should have been her superpower. "Company called Dataflow Solutions needs people to input information into spreadsheets. You can do it from your laptop, on your own schedule, and they don't care if you're doing it from a hospital bed or a yacht in the Bahamas. It's $12 an hour, which I know isn't going to make you rich, but it's $12 an hour more than you're making now. $12 an hour. In any other circumstance, I would have laughed at the idea of doing data entry for what amounted to slightly more than minimum wage. I had a college degree, damn it. I'd been a graphic designer with actual clients and a portfolio that didn't completely embarrass me. But graphic design required creativity and energy and the ability to stare at a screen for more than 15 minutes without wanting to throw up. And chemo had pretty much stolen all of those things from me. So $12 an hour to type numbers into boxes while fighting the urge to vomit? Yeah, that was exactly the level of ambition my life had achieved. "When do I start?" I asked, because apparently rock bottom came with a work-from-home opportunity. I started 3 days later, once Ruthie had helped me fill out more paperwork than should be legally required for a job that basically involved copying information from one place to another. Turns out, typing with hands that shake from chemo is its own special kind of hell, like trying to thread a needle during an earthquake while someone shouts random numbers at you. I'd sit there in my hospital bed with my laptop balanced on one of those rolling tables they use for meals, squinting at spreadsheets that all looked identical, inputting data about shipping manifests or inventory counts or whatever the hell Dataflow Solutions actually did, because honestly I never really figured that part out and didn't particularly care. The nausea was my constant companion, this rolling wave that would hit without warning and leave me scrambling for the plastic basin the nurses had given me, which I'd started calling my coworker because we spent so much quality time together. I'd be in the middle of a spreadsheet, typing away, feeling almost normal, and then suddenly my stomach would stage a revolt and I'd have to save my work, lean over, and introduce my coworker to whatever I'd managed to eat that day. Then I'd rinse my mouth, take a few deep breaths, and get right back to work, because nothing says living the dream quite like vomiting between data entries and pretending it's totally normal. But here's the thing about spite. It's a surprisingly effective fuel source. Every cell I filled in that spreadsheet felt like a middle finger to Melissa and her mother, to everyone who'd written me off as too expensive to bother with, to the universe itself for dealing me this particular hand of cards. $12 an hour doesn't sound like much, but when you're paying medical bills that look like phone numbers from another country, every penny feels like a small act of rebellion. I was surviving one spreadsheet at a time, and yeah, it was pathetic and exhausting, and sometimes I'd cry from sheer frustration when my hands wouldn't cooperate or my brain couldn't focus through the chemo fog. But I was doing it. I was still here, still fighting, still proving that I wasn't disposable. Mr. Amos seemed to understand this on some level that didn't require words. He'd show up during his rounds, humming those gospel songs that had become the soundtrack to my survival, and he'd just start fixing things. My bedside lamp that flickered like it was trying to communicate in Morse code? Fixed. My phone charger that only worked if you held it at exactly 37 degrees. Fixed with electrical tape and what I'm pretty sure was just sheer determination. Even my sense of humor, which had been pretty thoroughly destroyed by everything that had happened, somehow Mr. Amos helped fix that too, just by being present and calm and completely unbothered by the fact that I was a mess. "You're tougher than you look," he said one night, after I'd finished a particularly brutal shift of data entry that had taken me twice as long as it should have, because I'd had to stop every 20 minutes to either vomit or just stare at the ceiling and question my life choices. I looked at him, this quiet janitor who'd somehow become one of the most important people in my life without either of us really acknowledging it. "Don't set the bar too high," I croaked, my voice still rough from being sick. At this point, I'm surviving out of pure sarcasm and spite. If those ever run out, I'm screwed. He smiled, this small knowing smile that suggested he'd heard that kind of talk before and knew it for what it was, armor disguised as jokes. "Spites kept a lot of people alive longer than hope ever did," he said, then went back to mopping, humming something that sounded like Amazing Grace, but slower, sadder, like grace was something you had to fight for instead of something that just showed up. The hospital coffee became my other survival mechanism, though calling it coffee was generous. It tasted like someone had burned dirt, mixed it with regret, and served it in a styrofoam cup that leaked sadness. But it was free, and it was caffeinated, and it gave me something to do with my hands during the long stretches between data entry sessions when I was too wired to sleep, but too exhausted to do anything productive. I'd sit there sipping my terrible coffee, watching the sun come up through my window, thinking about how my life had become this weird combination of medical crisis and soul-crushing office work, and somehow I'd just keep going. Because what else was I going to do? Give up? Let Melissa and Darlene be right about me? Let cancer win without at least making it work for the victory? Absolutely not. I was going to survive out of pure stubborn spite if it killed me, which I realized was kind of contradictory, but whatever. Consistency wasn't really my strong suit anymore anyway. 3 months into my personal tour of hell, which included but was not limited to constant nausea, a bank account that looked like a typo, and the kind of exhaustion that makes sleeping feel like a full-time job, my phone rang with a number I'd deleted but apparently still had memorized, because trauma has a funny way of burning certain things into your brain, whether you want them there or not. For exactly one stupid, pathetic second, my heart did that thing where it jumps up all hopeful like a dog that doesn't understand its owner abandoned it at a rest stop 3 states back. Maybe she was calling to apologize. Maybe she'd realized what a massive mistake she'd made. Maybe she'd spent the last 3 months consumed with guilt and regret and had finally worked up the courage to beg for forgiveness. "Yeah, I should have known better." "Hey," Melissa said when I answered, her voice doing that fake casual thing people do when they're about to drop a bomb, but want to pretend it's no big deal. "How are you feeling?" I actually laughed, which turned into a cough, which reminded me that my body was still actively trying to kill me from the inside out. "Oh, living the dream. Vomiting regularly, can't keep food down, basically look like a hairless mole rat, working a data entry job that pays less per hour than your manicures cost. Just fantastic. Thanks for asking." 3 months later. There was a pause, the kind that told me she was trying to figure out if I was being sarcastic or genuine, which was hilarious, because when had I ever not been sarcastic? "I'm glad you're doing better," she said, completely missing the point in that special way she had of hearing only what she wanted to hear. "Melissa, I'm not doing better. I'm doing slightly less terrible, which is not the same thing. But I'm guessing you didn't call for a health update. So why don't you just tell me what you want?" Another pause, longer this time, and I could practically hear her gathering her nerve on the other end of the line. "I talked to my lawyer," she finally said, and there it was, the real reason for the call. "He says it would be better for both of us if you signed the divorce papers now. Cleaner, less complicated. We can just move on with our lives." I sat there in my hospital bed, which had become more familiar to me than my own apartment at this point, and felt something shift inside me. Not heartbreak. I'd already processed that during the 2 weeks I'd spent crying into hospital pillows that smelled like industrial detergent. This was something different, something sharper, better for both of us. I repeated slowly. That's interesting phrasing, considering one of us is fighting cancer alone while working 3 times as hard to stay alive, and the other one left because it was inconvenient. That's not fair, Melissa said, and I could hear the edge in her voice now, that defensive tone she always got when someone pointed out that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the hero of every story. I can't spend my best years watching someone fade away. That's not what I signed up for. You signed up for marriage, I said, louder than I intended, loud enough that a nurse walking past my room glanced in with concern. That was literally the entire point of the ceremony we spent $20,000 on. The vows, the cake nobody liked, your mother giving that speech about commitment. Remember any of that? You're being dramatic, she said, which was absolutely her go-to move whenever she didn't want to acknowledge that she might be wrong. I'm trying to do this the mature way. The mature way, I said, and I could hear the bitter laugh in my own voice, would have been sticking around. The mature way would have been having this conversation in person instead of abandoning me, and then calling 3 months later to make sure the paperwork goes smoothly. But sure, let's talk about maturity. See, this is exactly why we can't work, Melissa said, her voice going cold in that way it did when she decided she was the victim and everyone else was just being unreasonable. You're so angry all the time now. This isn't the man I married. You're right, I said, feeling something click into place, something final and irreversible. The man you married had hair and health insurance, and a wife who pretended to love him. That guy's gone. This version survived cancer treatment and abandonment and data entry at $12 an hour. This version knows exactly what he's worth, and more importantly, what he's not worth wasting time on. What's that supposed to mean? It means you didn't watch me fade, Melissa. You left before the commercial break. You don't get to call now and act like you were there for the hard parts. You weren't. You chose not to be. So yeah, I'll sign your papers, but not because it's better for both of us, because I deserve better than someone who puts a price tag on love and decides I'm not worth the investment. I could hear her breathing on the other end, could imagine her standing in whatever perfect apartment she was living in now, probably with her mother nearby, offering moral support and validation. I'll have my lawyers send them over, she said finally. All business now, the mask firmly back in place. You do that, I said. And Melissa? Lose my number. For real this time. I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking from adrenaline and probably also from the chemo, and just sat there staring at my phone like it had personally betrayed me. Which, in a way, it kind of had. Stupid thing wouldn't stop working just because I wanted to throw it against the wall and watch it shatter into a million pieces that represented my marriage. Mr. Amos showed up about 20 minutes later, pushing his mop cart with that steady, unhurried rhythm he had, humming something low and gospel-inflected. He took one look at my face and didn't say anything, just kept mopping, but he mopped slower near my bed, his presence this quiet, solid thing that somehow made the room feel less empty. My ex-wife just called, I said, not sure why I was telling him, but needing to tell someone who wouldn't try to fix it or make it better or offer platitudes about time healing all wounds. Wants me to sign divorce papers so she can move on with her life. Mr. Amos nodded, wrung out his mop with careful precision. Some people, he said quietly, don't know the difference between what costs money and what has value. I let that sit for a minute, turning it over in my head. Yeah, I said finally. Yeah, I think you're right. After he left, I found a sticky note in my bedside drawer, probably left over from when the nurses were tracking my medication schedule, and wrote on it in shaky handwriting, "You're not disposable." I stuck it on the mirror in my bathroom, right at eye level, where I'd see it every time I looked at my reflection, which currently resembled a before photo in one of those dramatic survival documentaries where the person barely makes it out alive but comes back stronger. I read it out loud a few times, testing how it felt in my mouth. You're not disposable. It sounded fake at first, like affirmations people post on Instagram next to pictures of their perfectly filtered lives. But I kept saying it anyway, every morning when I woke up and every night before I fell asleep, repeating it until it started to feel less like a lie and more like a possibility. The divorce papers showed up 4 days later via courier, because apparently Melissa's lawyer was efficient if nothing else. I signed them in the hospital cafeteria over terrible coffee and a turkey sandwich that tasted like cardboard's less ambitious cousin, and I didn't cry. Didn't feel much of anything except this weird sense of relief, like I'd been carrying something heavy for so long that I'd forgotten it was there until I finally put it down. I mailed them back that same day with a stamp I'd bought from the hospital gift shop, which felt appropriately depressing. Ending your marriage via mail from a cancer ward. But it was done. Officially over. Officially unsubscribed from a relationship that had terms and conditions I'd apparently never read carefully enough. That night, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, bald, gaunt, connected to an 4-pole like I was on some kind of really depressing leash, and read my sticky note again. "You're not disposable," I said to my reflection, and this time, for the first time, I almost believed it. I'd been in the hospital long enough that I'd started recognizing patterns in things nobody should ever have to notice, like how the lunch cart squeaked on Tuesdays but not Thursdays, or how the afternoon shift nurse always hummed off-key versions of 80s pop songs while checking vitals, or how the kid in the room next to mine cried every night around 8:30 like clockwork. Not loud crying. Not the kind that brings nurses running, but this quiet, heartbreaking sound that seeped through the walls and made me want to punch something, preferably the universe itself for being cruel enough to let children get cancer. His name was Tommy Cruz, and he was 7 years old, which I learned from overhearing nurses talking in hushed voices outside my door like I couldn't hear them through the paper-thin walls. 7. The age when you're supposed to be worried about homework and whether you're going to get that new video game for your birthday, not whether your white blood cell count is trending in the right direction. He had leukemia, the kind with a long medical name I couldn't pronounce even before chemo had turned my brain into Swiss cheese, and his parents couldn't visit much because they both worked 2 jobs and lived 3 towns away, which meant he was alone most of the time except for nurses who were too busy to do more than the basics. I met him officially about a week after he'd moved in, when I was shuffling down the hallway doing my daily walk that the doctors insisted was important for recovery, but felt more like an Olympic event given my current physical condition. He was standing outside his room in one of those hospital gowns that makes everyone look like they're wearing a decorated paper bag, staring at the vending machine like it held the secrets to the universe. "It's rigged," I said, because apparently my social skills had degraded along with my immune system. "The chips on the second row always get stuck." He looked up at me with these huge brown eyes that seemed way too old for his face, taking in my bald head and 4-pole with the kind of matter-of-fact assessment only kids can manage. "You have cancer too," he said, not a question, just a statement of observable fact. "Yeah," I said, because what else do you say? "The not fun kind." "Is there a fun kind?" he asked, and I actually laughed, which hurt but felt worth it. "Fair point. What are you in for?" "Leukemia," he said, pronouncing it carefully like he'd practiced. "The doctors say I'm doing good, though. Better than last month." "Well, that's something," I said, and we stood there for a minute in companionable silence, 2 bald guys in hospital gowns staring at a vending machine neither of us had the energy to fight with. That's when I noticed he was holding a plastic medicine cup, one of those little ones they use for pills, and he was looking at it with this intense concentration. "What V you got there?" I asked. "Building materials," he said seriously, then explained that he'd been collecting the cups from his medications and trying to build towers, but they kept falling over because the cups were too light and the hospital room floor wasn't level. I looked at this 7-year-old kid who was fighting cancer and dealing with absent parents and being alone in a scary place. And he was worried about architecture and structural integrity. "You know what?" I said. "I've got a whole collection of those cups in my room. Want to pool our resources and see what we can build." His face lit up in a way that made my chest hurt worse than the chemo ever had. And just like that, we became engineering partners in the world's most depressing construction project. We started small, basic towers made from stacking cups on top of each other, which fell over immediately and made Tommy giggle in this pure, unself-conscious way that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Then we got more ambitious, creating wider bases and experimenting with different stacking patterns. I'd sit on the floor of his room because the chairs were uncomfortable anyway, and we'd work in silence punctuated by his running commentary about load-bearing structures and weight distribution, concepts he'd apparently learned from watching building shows with his dad before all this happened. Mr. Amos started joining us sometimes. not saying much, but clearly supervising our architectural disasters while pretending to mop. He'd pause near our construction site, lean on his mop handle, and nod approvingly when we managed to get a tower higher than 3 cups without it immediately collapsing. Once he even contributed some extra cups he'd found somewhere, though I suspected he'd been stockpiling them specifically for our projects. "You're really bad at this," Tommy informed me one afternoon when I'd knocked over our most ambitious tower yet, a spiraling structure we'd been calling the Leaning Tower of Medicine. "Hey, I'm doing my best with shaky hands and chemo brain," I protested. "Besides, you're the architect here. I'm just the assistant who follows orders." "A really clumsy assistant," he said, but he was smiling, and I realized this was the first time I'd heard him talk without that undercurrent of sadness that seemed to follow him around like a shadow. We built skyscrapers between chemo drips, creating elaborate structures that would stand for hours before a passing nurse or a slight vibration would send them tumbling down in a cascade of plastic that sounded like rain. Tommy would document our creations with his mom's old phone, taking pictures from different angles like we were building actual architectural marvels instead of towers made from medical waste. He showed me his photo gallery once. Dozens of pictures of cup towers in various stages of completion and collapse, each one captioned with names like the Empire State Building but smaller, and the one that lasted until dinner. His parents came to visit on a Saturday, both of them looking exhausted in that bone-deep way that comes from working yourself to death just to keep your head above water. His mom cried when she saw him, gathering him up in this fierce hug that made me have to look away because it felt too private, too raw. His dad shook my hand and thanked me for spending time with Tommy, his voice cracking on the words, and I wanted to tell him that Tommy was helping me as much as I was helping him. Maybe more, but I didn't know how to say that without sounding like I was minimizing their struggle. After they left, Tommy was quiet for a while, sitting on his bed and staring at the cup tower we'd built that morning, a modest structure about 8 cups high that we'd managed to stabilize with careful placement. "They have to work," he said finally, "to pay for all this. The doctors and the medicine and everything." "Yeah," I said, because what else could I say? The system was broken, and we were all just trying to survive it. "When I grow up," Tommy said, his voice getting that determined quality kids get when they're making serious promises, "I'm going to be rich. And then I'm going to make sure kids don't have to be alone in hospitals because their parents are working." I felt something crack open in my chest, something that had been sealed shut since Melissa left, since I'd realized how alone I actually was in all this. "That's a good goal," I managed to say. "Really good." That night, lying in my own bed and staring at my own water-stained ceiling, I thought about Tommy and his absent parents and his cup towers and his determination to fix a broken system when he grew up. I thought about how when Tommy laughed, really laughed, not the polite kind but the kind that came from somewhere deep and genuine, the cancer felt smaller somehow, like it was still there, still trying to kill me, but it wasn't the only thing in the room anymore. I'd spent months thinking survival was just about me, about proving Melissa wrong, about making it through out of pure spite and stubbornness. But watching Tommy build towers out of medicine cups with hands that shook from treatment, seeing him smile despite everything he was going through, I realized something that should have been obvious but somehow wasn't. Surviving wasn't just for me anymore. It was for the people who still believed I had something to give. For a 7-year-old who needed someone to build ridiculous structures with between chemotherapy sessions. For Mr. Amos, who showed up every night with his gospel hymns and his quiet understanding. For Ruthie, who fought bureaucracy like it was a personal enemy. I wasn't just fighting cancer anymore. I was fighting to be the kind of person who deserved the faith these people, these unlikely, unexpected people, had somehow decided to place in me. And maybe, just maybe, that was a better reason to survive than spite ever was. Fast forward 5 years, and somehow, against all medical odds, statistical probability, and my ex-wife's confident predictions, I was still alive. Not just alive in the technical sense of having a pulse and occasionally remembering to breathe, but genuinely, stubbornly, spitefully alive in a way that felt like giving the universe a daily middle finger. The doctors used words like remission and remarkable recovery, with the kind of cautious optimism people use when they don't want to jinx things, and I'd gone from being the guy everyone expected to die to being the guy who absolutely refused to, which honestly felt like the biggest plot twist of my entire existence. But here's the thing nobody tells you about surviving cancer when you're broke. Beating the disease doesn't magically fix your bank account or erase the mountain of medical debt that's been accumulating interest like it's training for the Olympics. I'd survived, sure, barely, but I'd emerged on the other side looking at bills that had more zeros than I'd seen since my high school calculus class. The one I'd nearly failed because I was too busy being 17 and stupid to pay attention to anything useful. So I worked. Not one job like a normal person with reasonable life goals and healthy boundaries, but 3 jobs, because apparently my survival instinct had kicked into overdrive and decided that sleep was optional and free time was for quitters. During the day, I worked at a warehouse, one of those massive distribution centers that makes you feel like an insignificant cog in a machine designed by someone who actively hated human beings. I'd spend 8 hours lifting boxes that all weighed exactly enough to make your back hurt, but not enough to justify complaining about it, scanning barcodes until my eyes crossed, and trying not to think about how I'd gone to college specifically to avoid this kind of soul-crushing manual labor. At night, I stocked shelves at a grocery store, which sounds easy until you've spent 4 hours rotating canned goods and reorganizing cereal boxes, while fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they were slowly draining your will to live. There's something deeply existential about alphabetizing pasta sauce at 2 in the morning while a radio plays the same 6 songs on repeat, and you wonder if this is what surviving cancer was supposed to feel like. Exhausting, repetitive, and vaguely depressing in a way you can't quite articulate. And in between, during those precious few hours that normal people use for things like sleeping, or having a social life, or maintaining their mental health, I did data entry for Dataflow Solutions, still typing numbers into spreadsheets for $12 an hour like I had been in the hospital. Except now my hands didn't shake from chemo, and I only occasionally wanted to throw my laptop out the window instead of constantly. My diet had become 70% ramen. And I'm not talking about the fancy artisanal ramen from those trendy restaurants where a single bowl costs more than my hourly wage. I'm talking about the brick of sadness kind that costs 29 cents and tastes like salt had a fight with regret, and they both lost. I'd gotten creative with it out of sheer desperation, adding eggs when I could afford them, throwing in frozen vegetables that were on sale, occasionally splurging on hot sauce to pretend I was eating something that had flavor instead of just sodium and broken dreams. 20% of my diet was instant coffee, the cheap kind that came in a giant container and tasted like someone had burned disappointment and mixed it with water, but it kept me awake and functional, which was really all I was asking from my beverages at this point. I'd drink it black because milk cost extra money I didn't have, and I'd convinced myself that the bitterness was building character, though honestly it was probably just destroying my stomach lining. The remaining 10% was pure spite, meaning I was running on anger and stubbornness and the bone-deep satisfaction of proving everyone wrong. Every bill I paid off, every shift I completed, every morning I woke up still breathing felt like a personal victory over Melissa and her mother and everyone who'd written me off as a bad investment. Spite turns out to be surprisingly nutritious when you're trying to survive on basically nothing. I lived in a studio apartment that was generous in the same way calling a shoebox cozy is generous. It was small, cramped, and made you reconsider your life choices every time you walked through the door. The place smelled like a combination of burnt noodles and determination, which probably should have been concerning, but honestly just felt appropriate given my current life situation. The walls were so thin I could hear my neighbor, an elderly guy named Frank, sneeze from across the apartment, and then I'd hear him apologize to himself afterward, which was simultaneously depressing and kind of endearing. Frank and I had developed this weird rapport based entirely on the fact that we could hear each other's entire lives through the walls. He'd hear me come home at 3 in the morning from my grocery store shift, and I'd hear his TV playing westerns at a volume that suggested he was either hard of hearing or really committed to the experience. Sometimes he'd knock on my door with leftover casserole his daughter had brought him, claiming he couldn't finish it alone, but really just being kind in that subtle way old people have perfected where they help you without making you feel like charity. "You work too hard," he'd say, handing over a Tupperware container of something that actually contained vegetables and protein and other nutrients I'd mostly forgotten existed. "Just trying to pay off some bills," I'd say, taking the food gratefully because my pride had learned to take a back seat to my empty stomach. "Debt from the cancer?" he'd ask, because apparently my medical history was also audible through the walls. Among other things, I'd say, and he'd nod knowingly, pat my shoulder, and shuffle back to his apartment to watch more westerns at volumes that could probably be heard from space. Still, despite the exhaustion and the ramen and the constant feeling like I was one missed shift away from financial collapse, I was proud. Genuinely, surprisingly proud in a way I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. I'd paid off almost all my medical bills, not all of them, because that mountain was Everest-sized and I was climbing it with a spoon, but enough that I could see progress, actual measurable progress that showed up in my bank statements and made me feel like maybe I wasn't completely drowning anymore, just treading water in the deep end. No wife, obviously. Melissa was somewhere out there living her best life without the inconvenience of a sick husband, and I genuinely hoped she was happy in that distant way you hope for people you used to love before you realized they were never really capable of loving you back. No savings, because every penny I made went straight to bills or rent or ramen, with nothing left over for things like emergency funds or planning for the future or any of those adult concepts that seemed designed for people who hadn't spent their late 20s fighting cancer and abandonment simultaneously. No hair either, weirdly enough. It had grown back after chemo, but in this bizarre curly pattern that made me look like I'd stuck my finger in an electrical socket and decided to keep the look. My barber had actually laughed the first time I came in, not meanly, but in that surprised way people laugh when confronted with something unexpected, and I'd just shrugged because honestly after everything I'd been through, weird hair barely registered on my list of concerns. But I was alive. Genuinely, stubbornly, impossibly alive. And yeah, my life looked nothing like what I'd imagined when I was younger and stupider and thought things like marriage and career success were guarantees instead of privileges. But it was mine. I'd built it from nothing, from the ashes of the worst thing that had ever happened to me. And every shift I worked, and every bill I paid, and every morning I woke up in my tiny apartment that smelled like burnt noodles felt like proof that I'd survived something that should have killed me. Sarcasm had replaced therapy, which probably wasn't the healthiest coping mechanism, but was significantly cheaper and didn't require scheduling appointments or talking about my feelings with a stranger who nodded sympathetically while taking notes. I'd learned to laugh at the absurdity of it all, the fact that I'd survived cancer only to be defeated by grocery store shifts and instant ramen, the way my life had become this weird endurance test that nobody had asked me to take, but I was apparently acing anyway. And some nights, usually around 2 in the morning when I was too tired to sleep but too wired to rest, I'd sit on the floor of my apartment eating ramen straight from the pot, because washing dishes felt like too much effort, and I'd think about how far I'd come from that hospital bed where my wife had told me I was too expensive to save. I'd think about Ruthie with her binder and her determination, about Mr. Amos with his gospel songs and his quiet kindness, about Tommy and his medicine cup towers and his dreams of fixing the world. And I'd realize that maybe I hadn't just survived. Maybe I'd actually won. It was a Tuesday night, which I only knew because my work schedule had Tuesdays highlighted in yellow as warehouse closing shift followed by grocery store opening shift, meaning I had exactly 4 hours between jobs to sleep, eat, and question my life choices in that order. The time was 8:17 p.m., which I noticed because I'd just gotten home from the warehouse and was doing my nightly ritual of taking off steel-toed boots that had molded to my feet in ways that were probably medically concerning, while simultaneously trying to decide if I had the energy to actually cook ramen or if I should just eat it crunchy straight from the package like the world's saddest potato chip. I'd chosen the cooking route because even my rock-bottom standards had limits, and I was standing in my kitchenette. Calling it a kitchen would be generous since it was basically a hot plate, a mini fridge, and counter space the size of a cafeteria tray, waiting for water to boil in a pot I'd owned since college when someone knocked on my door. Not the tentative tap-tap-tap of my neighbor Frank checking if I wanted leftover meatloaf, but 3 polite, confident knocks that sounded like they came from someone who'd never questioned whether they belonged somewhere. I looked down at myself, wearing sweatpants that had a hole near the knee and a t-shirt that advertised a 5K run I'd never actually participated in but had gotten for free from a work event, and seriously considered just pretending I wasn't home. People who knocked with that kind of confidence at 8:17 on a Tuesday night were either selling religion or selling something worse, and I had neither the energy nor the disposable income for either option. But curiosity has always been my fatal flaw, right up there with misplaced optimism and a tendency to make poor life decisions. So I turned off the burner, because burning down my apartment would really complete my run of bad luck, and opened the door. Standing in my hallway, looking like he'd wandered out of a lawyer commercial that played during daytime TV, was a man who screamed money in every possible way. He was maybe 60, with silver hair styled in that casually perfect way that probably cost more than my monthly rent, wearing an Armani suit that I only recognized because I'd once dated a girl who was obsessed with fashion magazines back when I had both hair and hope. He was holding a leather briefcase that looked like it had never seen the inside of a subway car, and he was smiling at me with the kind of professional warmth that comes from years of delivering news to people who weren't sure if they should be excited or terrified. "Mr. Lawson?" he asked, and his voice had that smooth quality that suggested he'd gone to one of those fancy schools where they teach you how to sound trustworthy while potentially ruining your life. "Depends on who's asking," I said, because I'd learned the hard way that admitting your identity to strangers could lead to anything from jury duty to subpoenas, and I really didn't need either of those things added to my current plate of chaos. "My name is Graham Aldrich," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a business card that probably cost more per square inch than my entire wardrobe. "I'm an attorney with Aldrich and Hunt. May I come in? I'm here about a rather substantial inheritance." I actually laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a full-on, doubled-over, probably concerning laugh that made my ribs hurt and my eyes water. Behind me, my ramen water started boiling over with a hissing sound that perfectly captured the absurdity of this moment. "An inheritance," I repeated, trying to catch my breath while also trying to figure out if this was some elaborate scam or if I'd finally snapped from exhaustion and was hallucinating. "Listen, Mr. Aldrich, I appreciate the effort, but the only inheritance I'm expecting is debt, more debt, and maybe some aggressive sarcasm from my inner monologue. You've definitely got the wrong apartment. Try next door. Frank probably has relatives with money." But Graham Aldrich didn't look embarrassed or confused or like someone who'd made a mistake. He just stood there with his leather briefcase and his expensive suit and his patient smile, waiting for me to stop laughing like a crazy person. "I assure you, Mr. Lawson, I have the correct address. The inheritance in question is approximately $63 million, and the donor specifically requested you by name." The world kind of tilted sideways for a second, and I had to grab the doorframe to steady myself because my brain had apparently short-circuited somewhere between 63 and million. "I'm sorry, did you just say 63 million? As in, with 6 zeros? As in, more money than I've seen in my entire life combined, including that time I accidentally looked at someone else's bank statement at the ATM? 63 million, yes," Graham confirmed, like we were discussing something completely normal instead of an amount of money that existed only in lottery fantasies and fever dreams. "Perhaps we should discuss this inside? I have quite a bit of paperwork to go through, and your hallway, while charming, isn't exactly conducive to legal proceedings." I stepped aside because what else was I going to do? And Graham Aldrich walked into my studio apartment with the kind of grace that suggested he was used to much nicer surroundings, but was too professional to show it. He glanced around, taking in the futon that doubled as my bed and couch, the stack of ramen containers I'd been meaning to recycle, the pot of water still boiling over on my hot plate, and the general air of barely holding it together that permeated every surface. "Please, have a seat," I said, gesturing to my one chair, which I'd found on the curb 3 years ago and had never quite trusted to hold more than 150 pounds. I turned off the stove, moved my dinner dreams aside, and sat on my futon, which creaked in protest because even my furniture was exhausted. Graham set his briefcase on my makeshift coffee table, a plastic storage container I'd turned upside down, and opened it with the kind of precision that suggested he'd done this 1,000 times. Inside were folders, documents, papers with official-looking seals and signatures that made my eyes cross just looking at them. "I understand this must be quite shocking," he said, pulling out a folder and opening it to reveal what looked like a legal document written in that special language lawyers use that sounds like English but really isn't. The donor was very specific about wanting this to be a surprise, though I did advise that perhaps some warning might be appropriate. "Warning would have been great," I said, my voice sounding distant and strange to my own ears. "Maybe a text message? An email? A carrier pigeon?" Literally anything that would have prepared me for a random lawyer showing up at my door talking about more money than I've earned in my entire life. Graham smiled, and it was genuine this time, not professional. The donor had a flair for the dramatic, I'm afraid. He wanted you to experience the full impact of his gesture. He, I said, latching onto the pronoun because my brain was desperately trying to make sense of this situation. Who the hell do I know who has $63 million? I shop at discount grocery stores, and my most valuable possession is a coffee maker I got on sale. Graham pulled out another document, and I saw a name written at the top in official legal script that made my heart stop and restart in the space of a single breath. The donor was Amos Henderson, Graham said, watching my face carefully. I believe you knew him as Mr. Amos, the janitor from Denver Memorial Hospital. I stared at him. Then I stared at the document. Then I stared at him again, because clearly someone had made a mistake, a huge, impossible mistake that was going to be really embarrassing when they figured it out. Mr. Amos, I said slowly, like testing the words to see if they'd make sense coming out of my mouth. The janitor. The guy who hummed gospel songs and fixed my phone charger with electrical tape and left crackers on my hospital tray. That Mr. Amos. The very same, Graham confirmed. Had $63 million. I continued, still not believing this was real, still waiting for the punchline or the hidden camera or whatever cruel joke the universe was playing. Indeed, he was quite wealthy, though he chose to live modestly. I started laughing again, except this time it came out more like crying, or maybe some combination of both that didn't have a name because it was the sound of someone's entire reality shifting on its axis. He couldn't even spell my name right on the vending machine label he put on my four-pole, I said, and tears were definitely streaming down my face now. He called me Lawson for 3 months, and I never corrected him because it didn't matter, because he was kind and he showed up and he gave a damn when nobody else did. And now you're telling me he had enough money to buy a small island? He was a retired inventor, Graham explained, pulling out more documents that I couldn't focus on because my vision was blurry with tears. He held several patents on medical delivery systems, for pumps, medication dispensers, that sort of thing. They're used in hospitals worldwide. He made a considerable fortune from the royalties, but he lived simply and worked as a hospital janitor because, according to his personal notes, he wanted to stay connected to the people his inventions were supposed to help. I put my head in my hands, overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of it all. Why me? Why would he leave his money to me? Graham reached into the folder again and pulled out a single piece of paper, and his voice softened when he read it. In his will, he wrote, "For the man everyone left to die, but who kept living anyway. Tell him his wife was wrong. He wasn't too expensive to save." That sentence hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air out of my lungs and the strength out of my bones. I remembered Mr. Amos mopping my floor in silence, remembered him leaving crackers and granola bars, remembered him humming Amazing Grace while I cried into my pillow. I remembered thinking he was just being kind, just being a good person in a place where good people were in short supply. I'd never told him about Melissa, never mentioned what she'd said about me being too expensive to save. But somehow he'd known. Somehow, he'd seen everything I was going through and decided that I mattered, that I was worth fighting for, that my life had value even when I couldn't see it myself. He changed my entire life, I said through tears, my voice breaking on every word. And I didn't even know his last name. Graham Aldridge gave me a moment to completely fall apart, which I appreciated because I was doing it spectacularly, crying into my hands in my crappy studio apartment while a lawyer in an Armani suit sat on my curb-fine chair and pretended not to notice that I'd devolved into a sobbing mess. Eventually, when I'd managed to pull myself together enough to form coherent sentences instead of just making wounded animal noises, he opened another folder from his briefcase of life-changing documents and started explaining exactly who Amos Henderson had been. Turns out the guy who'd fixed my phone charger with tape and determination wasn't just some janitor who'd decided to spend his retirement pushing a mop around a cancer ward. He was a legitimate genius, the kind of person who probably could have been running a Fortune 500 company or teaching at MIT, but instead chose to spend his days cleaning floors and humming gospel songs to sick people who needed it. Graham showed me patent documents with Amos's name on them, Official government papers with seals and signatures that proved beyond any doubt that the man who'd left me crackers on my hospital tray had invented some of the most widely used medical equipment in the entire healthcare industry. This one here, Graham said, pointing to a patent dated 1987, is for an automated four-pump system that's currently used in approximately 60% of hospitals nationwide. And this one, he flipped to another page, is a medication delivery system that revolutionized how controlled substances are dispensed in medical settings. There are others, a total of 17 patents, all related to hospital equipment and medical technology. I stared at the documents like they were written in ancient hieroglyphics, my brain refusing to connect the man in these official papers with the guy who used to mop around my medicine cup towers with Tommy. He held patents on medical delivery systems used worldwide. I repeated, trying to make the words feel real in my mouth. The guy who I watched fix a broken mop handle with duct tape, and what I'm pretty sure was just optimism. He was worth over $60 million, Graham confirmed. But he lived like he made minimum wage. According to his financial records, he owned his house outright, a modest 3-bedroom in a middle-class neighborhood, drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic, and his biggest monthly expense was his donation to the hospital's charity fund. Graham paused, flipping through more papers. He worked as a janitor at Denver Memorial for 12 years after retiring from his company. Never told anyone who he really was. Just showed up, did his job, and went home. Why? I asked, because that was the part that didn't make any sense in a story that was already stretching the limits of believability. Why would someone with that much money and that much success spend their retirement mopping floors? Graham pulled out what looked like a personal letter, handwritten in shaky script that I immediately recognized as Amos's handwriting. I'd seen it on notes he'd occasionally leave, reminders about which vending machine buttons to avoid or which nurses would sneak you extra pudding cups if you asked nicely. He wrote this about 5 years before he passed away, Graham said. It was included with his will as an explanation of sorts. He handed me the letter, and I read it with tears blurring the words, having to blink repeatedly to make them come into focus. Amos's handwriting was messy but deliberate, the writing of someone who'd spent more time working with his hands than with pens. I made my money off sick people, the letter read. Built machines that helped them, sure, but also made millions doing it. Seemed wrong to spend all that money on fancy cars and big houses while the people my machines were supposed to help couldn't afford to use them. So I went back to the hospitals, not as an inventor or a businessman, but as someone who could be there in the middle of the night when folks were scared and alone. Figured that was worth more than any patent ever was. I had to stop reading because I couldn't see through the tears anymore, and my chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with my cancer history and everything to do with the fact that I'd been in the presence of actual human goodness and hadn't even fully appreciated it at the time. He wrote specifically about you, Graham said gently, pulling out another document from his seemingly endless supply of papers that were systematically destroying my emotional composure. These are notes he kept, personal observations from his time at the hospital. Would you like to hear them? I nodded because apparently I was a masochist who enjoyed having his heart ripped out and put back together in the span of a single evening. Graham cleared his throat and read in his professional lawyer voice that somehow made the words even more devastating. Patient in 304, Lawson, I think, though I keep writing it wrong, got left by his wife today. She told him he was too expensive to save, right there in the hospital room like she was returning a defective appliance. He hasn't stopped being polite to the nurses, though. Hasn't gotten mean or bitter, just keeps fighting. Reminds me why I do this job. He flipped to another entry. Lawson's working now, typing on his computer between getting sick from chemo. Ruthie got him set up with some data entry thing. Kid's determined, I'll give him that. Most people would have given up by now, but he just keeps going. Started building cup towers with the little Cruz boy, watching them laugh together while they're both fighting cancer. That's the kind of thing patents can't capture. Another page. Lawson told me today, I'm tougher than I look. He's got it backwards. He's the tough one. Surviving on spite and sarcasm and stubbornness, but surviving. That's worth something. That's worth everything. Graham looked up from the notes, his professional composure cracking slightly. The last entry about you was written 3 weeks before he passed away. If something happens to me, make sure Lawson knows he was worth saving. Give him the money. Let him prove his wife wrong. Let him live the life everyone said was too expensive. I couldn't even pretend to have it together anymore. I was full-on ugly crying. The kind of crying where you make embarrassing sounds and your face gets all red and snotty and you don't care because the emotion is too big to contain in anything resembling dignity. This man, this quiet, humble man who'd spent his evenings mopping floors and humming hymns, had seen me at my absolute worst and decided I was worth $63 million. Had seen me getting abandoned and sick and desperate and thought, that's the one who deserves everything I've built. He couldn't spell my name right, I said through sobs, which was a stupid thing to fixate on, but somehow felt important. 3 months, and he kept writing Lawson on labels and notes, and I never corrected him because it seemed rude, and now he's left me enough money to never worry about bills again. He knew how to spell your name, Graham said quietly. I found the hospital admission records and his personal effects. He had your correct information written down. I think he just liked the nickname. That somehow made it worse and better at the same time. The idea that Amos had been gently teasing me, creating this small intimacy in the middle of a cancer ward where everything else was clinical and terrifying. He'd seen me as a person, not a patient. As someone worth knowing, worth caring about, worth leaving a fortune to. What am I supposed to do with $63 million? I asked, not really expecting an answer because it was more of an existential question than a practical one. Graham smiled, closing his folders with the efficiency of someone who'd delivered this kind of news before, though probably not to someone sitting on a futon in sweatpants with holes in them. According to his will, you're supposed to live. That's it. No strings attached, no requirements about how you spend it or what you do with it. He just wanted you to have the chance to live without worrying about money, without having to work 3 jobs, without having to prove to anyone that you're worth saving. He pulled out one final document. The official will, I assumed, based on the amount of legal jargon crowding every available space. There is one clause, Graham added. He requested that if you choose to donate any of the money, you consider helping other patients who've been abandoned by their families. But it's a request, not a requirement. The money is yours to do with as you wish. Of course, Amos had thought about other people even in his will. Of course, his last act of generosity came with a gentle suggestion about paying it forward. That was exactly who he'd been. Someone who saw suffering and tried to fix it, whether with inventions or donations, or just showing up with crackers and gospel songs. When did he die? I asked, realizing I didn't even know when I'd lost him. About 4.5 years ago, Graham said. It's taken this long to settle the estate and locate you. You've moved several times, and you weren't exactly easy to track down. 4.5 years. I'd been living in poverty, working myself to exhaustion, eating ramen and surviving on spite, while $63 million had been waiting for me, left by a man who'd believed I deserved better. The timing was almost funny in a cosmic joke kind of way. I'd already proven I could survive, already shown I was tough enough to make it without the money, and now here it was anyway. He really changed my entire life? I said, looking at Graham, and then at the papers spread across my upside-down storage container coffee table. And I never even got to thank him. Graham stood, gathering his documents with practiced efficiency. I think he knew, and I think that's why he did it. The next morning, my phone exploded like I'd accidentally become famous overnight. The news had broken. Cancer survivor inherits $63 million. And suddenly, everyone I'd ever met wanted to reconnect and offer their totally not suspicious congratulations. My voicemail filled up within an hour. Old classmates I was pretty sure had bullied me suddenly remembered how close we'd been. Distant cousins materialized out of nowhere with investment opportunities. Even my email was drowning in messages from people who'd forgotten I existed until I became worth something. Then came Melissa's call. Babe, she said, and that nickname felt like a slap. I made a mistake. A huge mistake. I panicked when you got sick. Can't we start over? I actually laughed. Let me guess, you've been soul searching? Maybe in the last 24 hours since the news broke. Silence. All the answer I needed. Melissa, I fought cancer, abandonment, and poverty without you. I can't survive another toxic relationship. We're done. You're being cruel, she said. No, I'm being honest. Lose my number. Her mother Darlene called next, coughing dramatically. Sweetheart, your ex-wife is heartbroken. Good, I interrupted. So am I. about that $200 blender she took. I hung up and blocked them both. I didn't buy a mansion or a sports car or any of the ridiculous things people probably expected me to waste money on after suddenly becoming obscenely wealthy. Instead, I created the Amos Foundation for Abandoned Patients, a name that made lawyers nervous because apparently abandoned had legal implications, but I didn't care because that's exactly what it was for. People who'd been left behind by family or finances or a healthcare system that treated human lives like budget line items that needed to balance out. The foundation's mission was simple and personal. We paid off medical debts for people who'd been abandoned during treatment, people like me who'd been told they were too expensive to save and then had to figure out how to survive anyway. We covered bills for patients whose families had walked away, whose insurance had maxed out, whose GoFundMe campaigns had failed to go viral, because apparently suffering isn't compelling content unless it comes with good photography and a catchy hashtag. Within the first year, we cleared over $12 million in medical debt. $12 million. That's not money. That's hundreds of lives, hundreds of people who could finally breathe again without drowning in bills that had more zeros than hope. We worked with hospitals across the country, identifying patients who fit our criteria, reaching out quietly, because nobody wants their abandonment broadcast like some kind of tragedy porn. Sometimes we'd get thank you letters that made me cry in my office. Now an actual office instead of a studio apartment that smelled like burnt ramen. Sometimes we'd get no response at all, and that was fine too because dignity doesn't require gratitude. I kept Amos's old janitor badge on my desk in a simple frame. No fancy display, just the laminated ID card with his photo looking exactly like I remembered him. Calm, kind, completely unimpressed by the chaos of the world around him. Visitors would ask about it sometimes, confused about why a millionaire philanthropist had a janitor's badge as his most prominent decoration, and I'd tell them the whole story. About the man who mopped floors and hummed gospel songs and left crackers for dying patients who had nobody else. About the inventor who chose connection over comfort, service over status. About the person who saw me at my worst and decided I was worth everything. Sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, a lingering side effect of trauma that money couldn't quite fix, I'd imagine Amos walking into Heaven's break room, pouring himself terrible coffee, and saying to whoever was in charge up there, "Told you that kid would make it." I never heard from Melissa again after blocking her number, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. Rumor had it she was dating a chiropractor now, which I learned from a mutual friend who thought I'd want to know. I didn't, particularly, but I did hope she'd finally found someone who could adjust her morals along with her spine, because clearly they'd been misaligned for years. As for me, I was cancer-free, debt-free, and finally living proof that sometimes the people who abandon you end up watching you on the evening news, probably choking on their expensive wine while you're out there changing lives with money you earned by refusing to die when everyone said you should. I guess I wasn't too expensive to save after all, just too valuable for the wrong buyer. My wife texted at 2 a.m. Friday night. "Something came up at work. Relax, I'll explain, Sue." I said, "No need to explain. Stay with your boss, you're single now." 20 minutes later, she was frantically ringing the doorbell in tears. Look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I was some kind of insomniac workaholic who thrived on 3 hours of sleep and motivational podcasts. The truth is, I was lying in bed at 2:03 a.m. on a Friday night, staring at my ceiling like it owed me money, trying desperately to memorize a presentation that my boss would probably tear apart anyway, because Greg from accounting always had one more suggestion that derailed the entire meeting. Work had been absolutely brutal that week. The kind of brutal where you start questioning if a paycheck is really worth slowly dying inside a beige cubicle under fluorescent lights that made everyone look like extras from a zombie movie. So yeah, I wasn't asleep. I was just lying there in the dark, rehearsing bullet points in my head and wondering if anyone had ever actually died from PowerPoint-induced stress. That's when my phone decided to ruin what was left of my already garbage evening. The screen lit up like a tiny nuclear explosion on my nightstand, and I squinted at it with the enthusiasm of a man who knew nothing good ever came from notifications after midnight. It was a text from Clara, my wife of 8 years, the woman who color-coded our grocery lists and sent passive-aggressive calendar invites for quality time, like we were business associates scheduling a merger. The message read, "Something came up at work. Relax, I'll explain, Sue. I had to read it twice. Not because I didn't understand it, but because my brain physically rejected what it was seeing. Sue? Clara, the woman who once spent 20 minutes debating whether to use an Oxford comma in a birthday card, had just sent me a text with a typo. Clara, who corrected my grammar during arguments like she was grading a term paper, who literally had autocorrect on her autocorrect, had just casually thrown out Sue, like she was some teenager texting during math class. This was a woman who treated the English language like a sacred temple, and here she was, desecrating it at 2 in the morning with a 00 abomination. A typo from Clara wasn't just unusual. It was like watching a priest walk into a casino, sit down at the blackjack table, and ask the dealer if they accepted prayer as currency. Something was off. Way off. And I didn't need to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out what it was. Clara was supposed to be at a work dinner tonight, which apparently had now evolved into an after-hours situation that required staying out past midnight with her married boss, Richard, a guy who wore too much cologne and laughed at his own jokes like he was auditioning for a sitcom that nobody wanted to watch. She'd mentioned this dinner exactly 3 times over the past week, each time with a weird emphasis on how important and mandatory it was, like she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince me. And now here we were, in the dead of night, with her sending me typo-riddled damage control messages from God knows where. I sat up in bed, my heart doing that annoying thing where it speeds up, but you're trying to stay calm, because losing your cool at 2 a.m. feels dramatic even when it's completely justified. I stared at that message for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 30 seconds, watching the little typing dots appear and disappear like she was over there crafting the perfect follow-up lie. Part of me wanted to call her immediately and demand answers, but another part of me, the smarter, more petty part, knew exactly what to do. I opened the message thread, positioned my thumbs over the keyboard with the precision of a surgeon about to perform life-saving surgery, and typed out the most calm, collected, absolutely devastating response I could muster. No need to explain. Stay with your boss. You're single now. I read it once, twice, 3 times. Perfect. No emojis, no exclamation points, no angry misspellings that she could later use to paint me as the unhinged one. Just pure, concentrated peace wrapped in a single sentence that basically nuked 8 years of marriage in 26 characters. My finger hovered over the send button for maybe half a second before I thought, screw it, and pressed down like I was launching missiles. The message swooshed away into the digital void, and I felt this weird sense of calm wash over me. The kind of calm you feel when you finally make a decision you've been avoiding for way too long. And just like that, exactly 3 seconds after that message delivered, my phone started buzzing like it had been possessed by a swarm of angry bees auditioning for a horror movie. Call after call, text after text, the notifications rolling in so fast that my screen looked like a slot machine that just hit jackpot. I could see her name flashing over and over. Clara, Clara, Clara. Each call more desperate than the last, probably accompanied by whatever panicked explanation she'd frantically cobbled together in the parking lot of wherever she actually was. But here's the thing about finally reaching your limit with someone. You stop caring about their panic. You stop feeling obligated to answer just because they suddenly realize they screwed up. If Clara could stay out until 2 a.m. doing whatever sketchy nonsense she was doing, then she could stay out permanently as far as I was concerned. I reached over, picked up my phone with all the enthusiasm of someone picking up a piece of junk mail, and did something I'd been wanting to do for weeks without realizing it. I flipped it face down on the nightstand and rolled over. The buzzing continued, muffled now against the wood surface, sounding like an angry wasp trapped in a jar. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Call declined. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Call declined. It was almost rhythmic, almost soothing in a weird way, like the universe's most annoying white noise machine. Each ignored call felt like a tiny victory, a small reclamation of my dignity that had been slowly eroding over the past few months while I pretended not to notice Clara's increasingly suspicious behavior. I lay there in the dark, listening to my phone have a full-blown meltdown on my behalf, and realized something that probably should have occurred to me way earlier. I felt relieved. Not angry, not heartbroken, not even particularly surprised, just relieved. Relieved that I finally had a reason to stop pretending everything was fine relieved that I didn't have to keep making excuses for why my wife was suddenly working late 3 times a week, relieved that I could finally stop lying to myself about what was clearly happening. The signs had been there for weeks, maybe even months. The new wardrobe full of clothes that were way too fancy for selling office furniture, the sudden interest in going to the gym at weird hours, the way she'd started angling her phone away from me when she texted, like I was some kind of corporate spy trying to steal classified information. My phone finally stopped buzzing around the 15th or 20th call. I'd honestly lost count, and the silence that followed was genuinely beautiful. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, feeling more relaxed than I had in months, and thought about how wild it was that my entire marriage had basically ended via text message at 2 a.m. on a random Friday. No dramatic confrontation, no screaming match, no throwing dishes, or whatever people do in movies when relationships implode. Just a simple text message, a typo that gave away the game, and a calm response that sealed the deal. Honestly, it was almost poetic in its efficiency. As I finally started drifting off to sleep around 2:30, my last conscious thought was wondering how long it would take Clara to show up at the house, because there was absolutely no way she was going to accept that text message as the final word. I gave it maybe 20 minutes before I heard her car in the driveway, maybe 30 before she started banging on the door like the house was on fire. And you know what? I was absolutely right. But that's a problem for future Henry to deal with. Present Henry was going to enjoy this peaceful moment and maybe, just maybe, get a decent night's sleep for the first time in forever. I'm not gonna lie, I was kind of impressed with my own prediction skills because exactly 22 minutes after I sent that text. Yes, I checked the time because I'm petty like that. I heard the unmistakable sound of tires screeching into our driveway like someone was auditioning for Fast and Furious, Suburban Meltdown Edition. The car door slammed with enough force to probably wake up everyone within a 3-block radius. And then came the frantic knocking that sounded less like knocking and more like someone trying to break through a door during a zombie apocalypse. But Clara wasn't satisfied with just the knocking. Oh no, that would be too subtle for the panic she was currently experiencing. She went straight for the doorbell. And I mean, she went for it like it was a game show buzzer and the grand prize was saving her marriage. Ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, ding dong. The doorbell was going off so repeatedly and aggressively that it stopped sounding like a doorbell and started sounding like a fire alarm having an existential crisis. I could picture her out there, finger glued to that button, probably crying, definitely panicking, absolutely losing whatever composure she thought she'd maintained during her little after-hours adventure with Richard the Boss Man. Part of me wondered if she'd eventually just break the doorbell entirely, and honestly, I wouldn't have been that upset about it because that thing was annoying even under normal circumstances. But here's the thing about being the one with the upper hand in a situation like this. You get to control the pace. You get to decide when and how things happen. So instead of rushing to the door like some desperate fool who was ready to accept whatever half-baked excuse she'd cooked up during her drive home, I decided to take my sweet time. I got out of bed with all the urgency of a sloth on vacation, stretched a little bit because my back had been killing me from that terrible office chair I'd been complaining about for months, and shuffled into the bathroom like it was just another regular night and not the dramatic implosion of my marriage. I brushed my teeth. Thoroughly. Like, I'm talking a full 2 minutes of brushing, the way dentists always tell you to do, but nobody actually does, because who has that kind of time in the morning? I even flossed, which I probably hadn't done in a week, because why not? Clara was out there having a complete meltdown, and I was in here practicing excellent oral hygiene. I caught my reflection in the mirror and had to admit, I looked pretty damn calm for a guy whose wife had just been caught red-handed, or should I say red-lipsticked, in what was definitely not a work emergency. My hair was a mess, sure, but there was something almost zen about my expression, like I'd achieved some kind of inner peace that only comes from finally stopping the denial and accepting reality for what it is. The doorbell was still going strong when I finally decided to put on a t-shirt. The one that said, "I'm not arguing, I'm just explaining why I'm right," which felt weirdly appropriate for the occasion. I took one last look in the mirror, nodded at myself like I was some kind of motivational speaker about to give the performance of a lifetime, and headed toward the front door with the casual energy of someone who was about to check if the pizza delivery guy had arrived, not confront his cheating wife. The knocking had evolved now into full-on pounding, the kind where you know someone's using both fists, and I could hear Clara's voice through the door, muffled but definitely frantic, yelling something about needing to explain. I stopped at the front door and looked through the peephole, because even in moments of marital destruction, home security is important, and what I saw was honestly better than any reality TV show I'd ever watched. There was Clara, and she looked absolutely wrecked. Her makeup, which had probably been perfectly applied earlier in the evening for her work dinner, was now smeared down her face like an abstract painting titled Bad Decisions. Her mascara had created these little black rivers down her cheeks, her lipstick. And yes, I noticed it was that expensive red shade she only wore for special occasions, was smudged across her face like she'd been making out with someone. Which, let's be real, she definitely had been. Her hair, normally styled to perfection because Clara didn't do anything halfway, looked like she'd stuck her head out of a car window going 80 on the highway, all tangled and wild, and completely betraying whatever story she was about to try to sell me. I let her stew there for another 10 seconds, watching through the peephole as she went from pounding to pressing her face against the door, probably trying to hear if I was even home, which was hilarious, because where else would I be at almost 2:30 in the morning? Then I unlocked the deadbolt with the slowest, most deliberate motion I could manage, hearing it click in a way that made Clara immediately stop knocking and step back. I cracked the door open just enough to see her properly, but not enough for her to try to push her way in, because I'd seen enough movies to know that move was coming. "Please open the door, Henry. I can explain," she practically screamed, her voice doing that high-pitched, desperate thing that probably would have worked on me 6 months ago, but now just sounded like nails on a chalkboard. I leaned against the doorframe, keeping my expression as neutral as possible, and said, "Explain what? Why your work emergency required red lipstick and perfume that costs half my salary." I could smell it from where I was standing, that fancy designer perfume she'd bought last month and claimed was for boosting her confidence at work. Yeah, apparently her confidence needed boosting all the way into Richard's car or office, or wherever the hell they'd been. "It's not what you think," she stammered, and I had to physically stop myself from laughing because that line, that exact line, has never in the history of caught cheaters ever been followed by anything good. "Oh really?" I said, letting the sarcasm drip from every word. "Because I think you won Employee of the Month in a very personal department, and I'm guessing the awards ceremony was very hands-on." Her eyes went wide, and she opened her mouth to respond, but I noticed something happening in my peripheral vision that made the whole situation even better. Lights were starting to come on in the neighbors' houses. First it was old Mrs. Henderson across the street. That woman never missed any neighborhood drama. I swear she had some kind of gossip radar. Then the Johnsons' porch light flicked on next door, and I could see their curtains moving like they were settling in for the show. Even the Martinez family's upstairs window lit up, and I was pretty sure I saw their teenage son holding up his phone, probably recording this whole thing for TikTok or whatever the kids were using these days. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Let them all see the midnight soap opera. Let them watch Clara, the woman who was always so concerned about appearances and what the neighbors thought, have her complete breakdown on our front porch at 2:30 in the morning. The same woman who'd scolded me for leaving the garbage cans out too long because it looked tacky was now providing live entertainment for the entire street, while wearing the evidence of her affair like a scarlet letter made of smeared cosmetics. "Henry, please, can we talk inside?" Clara whispered urgently, finally noticing that we had acquired an audience. She kept trying to see past me into the house, like she thought she could just walk in and we'd have some quiet, rational conversation where she'd explain away everything and I'd nod and forgive her because that's what we were supposed to do after 8 years of marriage. "Nah, I'm good right here," I said, getting more comfortable against the doorframe. "Besides, I think the neighbors deserve some entertainment. Mrs. Henderson hasn't had this much excitement since her cat got stuck in a tree last summer." I was pretty sure I heard someone chuckle from one of the nearby houses, which just made the whole thing even more satisfying. Clara's face cycled through about 17 different emotions in 5 seconds. Embarrassment, anger, desperation, panic, and finally landing on what I can only describe as the realization that she had absolutely zero control over this situation. Her perfect little world, the one where she could have her stable marriage and her exciting affair, and keep both running smoothly without anyone finding out, had just exploded spectacularly in the most public way possible. And honestly, I was living for every second of it. "You're being ridiculous," she hissed, trying to keep her voice down now that she'd realized half the neighborhood was watching her personal disaster unfold in real time. "Ridiculous?" I repeated, raising my voice just enough that Mrs. Henderson could definitely hear me. "No. What's ridiculous is you thinking I'm stupid enough to believe whatever excuse you're about to make up on the spot." I paused for dramatic effect, because why not? "So go ahead, Clara. The stage is yours. Explain to me and everyone watching why you're coming home at 2:30 in the morning looking like you lost a fight with a makeup counter." The look on her face told me she was about to launch into her explanation, and I was absolutely ready for whatever ridiculous story she'd concocted during her panic drive home. This was going to be good. Clara took a deep breath, and I could literally see her brain working overtime trying to construct whatever fictional masterpiece she was about to present as the truth. Her eyes were darting around like she was reading invisible cue cards floating in the air, and I had to give her credit for one thing. She was really committed to this performance. Too bad I'd already seen the ending and knew it sucked. "My boss called about a deadline," she blurted out, and I swear I almost applauded right there because that was her opening statement. That was the best she could come up with after a 22-minute drive where she presumably had time to craft the perfect alibi. I'd seen better lies from politicians caught with offshore bank accounts. I nodded slowly, pretending to consider this absolutely groundbreaking explanation. "A deadline," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air like a bad smell. "At 2 a.m.? Clara, you're not a trauma surgeon saving lives. You're not a firefighter responding to emergencies. You sell office chairs." Office chairs. The kind of furniture that people sit on from 9 to 5 during business hours, when deadlines are actually relevant. I paused, watching her face cycle through emotions like a slot machine. "So unless someone urgently needed a ergonomic lumbar support system delivered to their house in the middle of the night, I'm calling bullshit on that one." Her mouth opened and closed a few times, and I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she scrambled for version 2.0 of her terrible excuse. Mrs. Henderson's porch light was still on, across the street, and I was 99% sure I saw her standing at her window with binoculars, which was honestly the kind of energy I needed in my life right now. The woman was committed to her craft. "Okay, fine," Clara started, and I loved how she said it like she was doing me some huge favor by upgrading from one lie to a slightly different lie. His wife was sick, and he needed someone to talk to. It was an emotional emergency, Henry. I was being a good colleague, showing compassion during a difficult time. She actually put her hand over her heart when she said this, like she was some kind of humanitarian accepting an award for exceptional workplace empathy. I blinked at her. Once. Twice. Then I said, completely deadpan, "He's divorced." You know that sound that vinyl records make when someone scratches them? That screech noise? That's basically what happened in Clara's brain at that exact moment. Her entire face froze like someone had hit pause on a DVD player. Her hand was still over her heart in that fake compassionate gesture, but her eyes had gone completely blank, like her internal operating system had just crashed and was showing nothing but a blue screen of death. "What?" she whispered, and I could see the panic starting to really set in now because she'd just been caught in such an easily disprovable lie that even she couldn't figure out how to spin it. "Richard got divorced 6 months ago," I explained, speaking slowly like I was teaching a kindergarten class basic edition. "Remember? You told me about it. You came home all concerned about how he was handling the separation, how sad he seemed, how he was really struggling with being alone." I tapped my chin thoughtfully. "Actually, now that I think about it, that's right around when you started all these late-night work emergencies, isn't it? Funny how that timing works out." Clara looked like she was trying to mentally time travel back to 6 months ago to remember what lies she'd already told me so she could keep her story straight, but it was way too late for that. The ship had sailed, the train had left the station, and the horse had left the barn. Pick your metaphor, they all applied. She was drowning, and I was just standing there on the shore, refusing to throw her a life preserver. "I meant," she stammered, and I could see her eyes doing that thing again where they looked everywhere except at me, like the answer to her problems was written on our porch ceiling or hidden in the bushes. "His dog was sick." "Yeah, his dog. He has that golden retriever, remember? And she's old, and he thought she might not make it through the night, and he was really upset about it." I let that statement sit in the silence for a moment, just marinating in its own absurdity, while I contemplated whether my wife had actually just suggested that she stayed out until 2:30 in the morning to provide emotional support for a man whose hypothetical dog was hypothetically dying. The creativity was almost impressive if it wasn't so insulting to my intelligence. Right? I said, drawing out the word like it had about 15 extra syllables. So you went to comfort the dog. That makes total sense. Tell me, did you bring flowers for the funeral? Or did you go with a nice chew toy as a get-well-soon gift? Maybe some of those fancy organic dog treats from that expensive pet store downtown. I crossed my arms, really getting into the performance now. Clara's face went from pale to red so fast I was worried she might actually spontaneously combust right there on my porch, which would have been unfortunate because I'd just had the wood refinished last summer and bloodstains were probably not covered under warranty. She opened her mouth to respond, probably to dig herself even deeper into this hole she'd created, but I could see the exact moment when her brain just gave up entirely. Her eyes went kind of vacant, like a robot whose programming had encountered an error it couldn't resolve, and I swear I could almost hear the Windows shutdown noise playing in her head. "You're impossible," she finally cried, and I had to laugh because that was her defense now. I was impossible. I wasn't the one making up increasingly ridiculous stories about sick wives who weren't sick and weren't wives, and dying dogs that probably didn't exist, at 2:30 in the morning while covered in evidence of an affair. No, just awake, I corrected her. Very, very awake. And also not stupid, which seems to be a quality you were banking on me having tonight. That's when I noticed something that made this entire situation even better, if that was possible. Clara's car was sitting in the driveway, parked at this weird angle like she'd been in such a rush that she'd forgotten how parking worked. But here's the thing that made me pause. Her car was here. In our driveway. She hadn't even left the neighborhood, probably. If she'd actually been at the office with Richard like she'd claimed, or at his place comforting his sick fake wife or dying fake dog, she would have had to drive at least 20 minutes each way. But looking at her car, looking at the way she'd peeled into the driveway, looking at how fast she'd gotten here after my text, I did some quick mental math and realized something hilarious. "So tell me, Clara," I said, and I could feel the smile spreading across my face despite my best efforts to maintain my cool, detached demeanor. "Did your boss teleport you to the office? Because according to my very basic understanding of time and space, there's no way you could have been where you said you were and made it back here as fast as you did. Unless Richard has access to some kind of Star Trek transporter technology that I don't know about. In which case, honestly, I'm more impressed than angry." Her face did something I'd never seen before. It was like watching someone realize they'd just failed a test they thought they'd aced. Every muscle in her face seemed to be fighting against every other muscle, creating this expression that was part horror, part disbelief, and part resignation. She knew she was caught. Not just caught in a lie, but caught in a whole web of lies that were contradicting each other and falling apart faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. She started, but nothing came after that. Just, hanging in the air like a lonely word that had lost all its friends. "You what?" I prompted, leaning forward slightly. "You were actually parked 2 blocks away in the McDonald's parking lot making out with your boss in his car, like you're both 16 years old again? You were at that sketchy motel off Highway 9 that charges by the hour and has a sign that says clean rooms, which automatically means the rooms are definitely not clean? Where were you, Clara? Because it definitely wasn't where you said you were." And that's when the tears really started. Not the cute, delicate tears you see in movies where one single drop rolls down a perfectly made-up face. No, these were the ugly tears, the ones that come with snot and hiccuping and that weird gasping sound people make when they're trying to cry and breathe at the same time and failing at both. Her mascara, which had already been doing a pretty terrible job of staying where it was supposed to be, completely gave up and created these black streaks down her face that made her look like a sad raccoon who'd just been caught going through someone's garbage. I stood there watching this performance, and honestly, part of me was impressed by the commitment. If lying was an Olympic sport, Clara wouldn't win gold, but she'd definitely get points for artistic interpretation. If terrible excuses burned calories, she'd have abs that could cut diamonds by now. But mostly, I just felt tired. Tired of the lies, tired of the drama, tired of pretending that I hadn't known something was wrong for weeks now. "Let's make this easy," I finally said. Clara was in full meltdown mode now, doing that thing where she was crying so hard that actual words were becoming difficult to form, and honestly, I'd had about enough of this outdoor theater production. We'd been standing at my doorway for what felt like an eternity, and I was getting tired of watching her try to juggle 17 different lies while simultaneously having an emotional breakdown. It was like watching someone try to play Jenga during an earthquake. Messy, chaotic, and destined to end badly. "Let's make this easy," I said, cutting through her sobs like a knife through butter. "Let's skip past all the creative fiction and the award-worthy acting and get to the part where you tell me the truth. I'm going to ask you one simple question, and I want one simple answer. No stories about sick wives, dying dogs, or emergency furniture deadlines. Just yes or no. Can you handle that?" She looked up at me with those red, puffy eyes, mascara still making its tragic journey down her face, and nodded weakly like a bobblehead that had given up on life. I could see her trying to brace herself for whatever question was coming, probably running through a mental checklist of which lies she could still salvage and which ones were completely torched. "Who is it?" I asked, keeping my voice steady and calm, like I was asking her what she wanted for dinner and not who she'd been cheating on me with. She froze. Completely froze. Like someone had hit pause on her entire existence. Her mouth was slightly open, one hand still clutching the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping her upright, and I watched as every possible response flickered across her face in real time. She was calculating whether she could still deny it, whether she could spin this into something less damaging, whether she could somehow make this my fault instead of hers. I'd been married to this woman for 8 years. I could read her like a book, and right now, that book was titled, "Oh shit, I'm caught and I don't know what to do." "I was with someone," she finally whispered, and I had to resist the urge to slow clap because wow, what a confession. So Vega was basically useless, but I guess she thought that admitting to someone was somehow better than admitting to a specific person with a specific name who was specifically her married boss. "The boss?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. But see, this was important. I needed to hear her say it. I needed her to actually admit it out loud instead of hiding behind pronouns and vague statements that could technically be interpreted multiple ways if you squinted hard enough. Clara's face went completely white, like someone had literally drained all the blood from her head. Her eyes got huge, and she looked at me like I'd just performed some kind of black magic mind-reading trick instead of just connecting the incredibly obvious dots that a golden retriever could have connected. "How did you?" She started, but the words died in her throat because she'd just confirmed it without actually meaning to confirm it. I smiled, and not a friendly smile either. This was the smile of someone who'd just won an argument before it even started. "Lucky guess," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Also, I'm not blind. You've been dressing like LinkedIn Barbie for weeks now. New clothes, new hair, new perfume, suddenly caring about looking professional when you're literally selling chairs to people who don't care if you show up in a potato sack as long as the price is right." The dots weren't exactly hard to connect, Clara. They were practically drawing themselves. I thought about all those mornings over the past few weeks when she'd spend an extra hour getting ready for work, trying on 3 different outfits and asking me which one looked more professional, whatever that meant. I thought about how she'd started going to the gym at weird hours, how her phone had suddenly become this Fort Knox-level secure device that she never let out of her sight, how she'd developed this nervous habit of angling it away from me whenever a notification popped up. I thought about all the times she'd mentioned Richard's name in conversation, always with this weird emphasis, like she was testing how I'd react to hearing about him. The signs had been there the whole time. I'd just been choosing to ignore them because acknowledging them meant dealing with them, and dealing with them meant blowing up my entire life. She cried harder now, these big, heaving sobs that shook her whole body, and I wondered if she was crying because she felt genuinely guilty or because she'd gotten caught. There's a difference, you know. One is actual remorse about hurting someone you supposedly love, and the other is just being upset that your secret fun time had come to an end. Based on the way she kept glancing at her phone like she was hoping Richard would call with some magical solution to this disaster, I was betting on option 2. It wasn't planned. She managed to choke out between sobs, and I actually laughed out loud at that one. Couldn't help it. That line, "It wasn't planned," was right up there with "It just happened," and it didn't mean anything in the cheater's handbook of terrible excuses that nobody believes. Oh yes, I said, really leaning into the sarcasm now because if I didn't laugh, I was probably going to punch a wall, and I'd already mentioned that I didn't want to punch walls. The classic, the printer jammed, and so did my moral story. I've heard that one before. It's a real page-turner. Let me guess how it goes. You were both working late, probably on some made-up project that definitely required you to be alone together after hours. And then there was this moment, this magical moment where you looked at each other, and suddenly 8 years of marriage just evaporated like morning dew. And before you knew it, whoops, you accidentally fell onto his dick. Multiple times. Over several weeks. What a tragic accident. Clara gasped like I'd just slapped her, which was rich considering she was the one who'd been conducting a full-blown affair, and I was just the guy pointing out the obvious. Can you stop making jokes? She asked, her voice going up about 3 octaves into that territory where dogs could probably hear it, but humans were struggling. Not really, I admitted, shrugging. Humor helps me not punch walls. And trust me, you want me making jokes right now because the alternative is significantly less pleasant for both of us. I leaned against the doorframe again, getting comfortable because this conversation was clearly going to last longer than I'd initially anticipated. Besides, what do you want me to do? Cry? Beg you to stay? Fall on my knees and ask what I did wrong to drive you into the arms of Richard, the divorced office chair mogul with the overpriced cologne and the midlife crisis sports car. I could see our other neighbors now. The Johnsons had actually come out onto their porch with what looked like popcorn, which was honestly the kind of commitment to neighborhood drama that I respected. Mr. Martinez was definitely recording this on his phone, probably already planning how to edit it for maximum viral potential. Mrs. Henderson had upgraded from binoculars to standing directly at her window, completely unashamed about her front row seat to the Henderson Street Theater production of Marriage Collapse, the musical. Clara noticed our audience too and tried to lower her voice, leaning in closer to the door like that would somehow make this conversation more private despite the fact that she'd been screaming and crying loud enough to wake up the entire zip code for the past 20 minutes. Can we please talk about this inside? She whispered desperately. This is humiliating. Oh, now it's humiliating? I asked, raising my eyebrows. It wasn't humiliating when you were sneaking around with your boss? It wasn't humiliating when you were lying to my face about work dinners and sick dogs? It wasn't humiliating when you sent me that text message with a typo because you were too busy doing God knows what to proofread? But now that people are watching, suddenly you're worried about being humiliated. I shook my head. Sorry, Clara, but you don't get to control the narrative anymore. You lost that privilege when you decided to throw away our marriage for someone who probably still uses Internet Explorer. She reached out like she was going to grab my arm, do that thing where she touched me and looked into my eyes and tried to make me remember all the good times we'd had together, all the reasons I'd married her in the first place. But I stepped back before she could make contact, and I saw something break in her face when I did that. Like she'd just realized that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't something she could fix with tears and touching and empty promises. At least you picked someone with a decent salary, I continued, because apparently I wasn't done twisting the knife yet. Would have been embarrassing if it was the IT guy, Derek, with his Lord of the Rings lunchbox and his collection of anime figurines. At least Richard can probably afford to take you to restaurants that don't have a drive-through window. Though honestly, given the choice between someone who's passionate about programming and someone who's passionate about ergonomic office solutions, I might have gone with Derek. At least he has interesting hobbies. Her tears kicked into turbo mode, and I was genuinely starting to wonder if she was going to dehydrate herself right there on my porch. The crying had reached that level where it wasn't even producing sound anymore, just this weird gasping, hiccuping thing that made her whole body shudder. Part of me, a very small part that was buried under about 17 layers of anger and betrayal, felt bad for being so harsh. But then I remembered that she'd spent the last however many weeks lying to my face, and that small part of me shut up real quick. You don't understand, she managed to say through the sobs. It's complicated. No, it's really not, I said flatly. It's actually incredibly simple. You wanted to have an affair, so you had an affair. You wanted to feel desired and exciting and like you were the main character in some romantic drama instead of just a regular person in a regular marriage, so you went out and made that happen. The only complicated part is all the lying you had to do to keep it going, and honestly, you weren't even good at that part. I could tell she wanted to argue, wanted to explain all the ways it actually was complicated and how I just didn't understand what she was going through. But we both knew that anything she said at this point was just going to dig the hole deeper. She'd already confirmed the affair, already admitted to being with someone, already accidentally revealed it was Richard. The damage was done. The marriage was over. All that was left now was the cleanup. I'd had enough of standing at the doorway having this conversation that was going absolutely nowhere except in circles of tears and terrible excuses. My feet were getting cold on the hardwood floor. The neighbors had probably seen enough drama to last them through the next 5 homeowners association meetings, and honestly, I needed caffeine if I was going to continue dealing with this absolute dumpster fire of a situation. So I did what any reasonable person would do at almost 3 in the morning while their marriage imploded. I turned around and headed for the kitchen to make coffee. "Where are you going?" Clara called after me, her voice cracking with panic like I was abandoning her in the middle of a burning building instead of just walking away from my own front door in my own house. "To make coffee," I called back over my shoulder, not even bothering to turn around. Because apparently I handle betrayal with caffeine and sarcasm, and I'm currently running low on one of those things. I heard her footsteps behind me, that distinct clicking sound her fancy heels made on the floor, the same heels she'd bought last month claiming they were on sale, but definitely weren't. The same heels she'd probably worn specifically for Richard because she knew they made her legs look good. Everything was starting to make sense now. All those little purchases and wardrobe upgrades that she'd explained away as treating herself or boosting her professional image. Yeah, professional. Right. She followed me into the kitchen, still crying, still looking like she'd been through an emotional blender set on the highest speed, and I ignored her while I went through the familiar ritual of making coffee. I pulled out my favorite mug, the one that said "World's Okayest Husband," which felt weirdly appropriate now, and started measuring out the grounds with the kind of precision usually reserved for bomb defusal. The coffee maker gurgled to life, and the smell started filling the kitchen, that rich, dark aroma that was basically the only thing keeping me from completely losing my mind right now. Clara stood there in the middle of my kitchen, wringing her hands like some kind of Victorian heroine from a tragic novel, and I could tell she was trying to figure out her next move. Should she keep crying? Should she try apologizing again? Should she attempt to explain herself more clearly? I could practically see the gears turning in her head, trying to calculate which approach would work best, which version of herself she should present to get the outcome she wanted. "You can't just throw away 8 years, she finally blurted out. And there it was. The appeal to our history together. The classic move of someone who'd screwed up and was now trying to use time investment as leverage. Like our marriage was some kind of sunk cost fallacy that I had to honor because we'd already put in the work. I turned around slowly, leaning against the counter while the coffee maker did its thing behind me, and looked at her with the kind of expression you'd give someone who just claimed the earth was flat. "Funny," I said, letting each word land with weight. "You threw them first. In fact, you've probably been throwing them for weeks, maybe months, every single time you chose to lie to me, every time you got dressed up for him, every time you deleted a text message or angled your phone away from me like I was some kind of surveillance camera you needed to avoid." The coffee maker beeped, that cheerful little sound that meant my salvation was ready, and I turned to pour myself a cup, taking my time with it like I was some kind of coffee sommelier and this was a tasting event. I added cream, stirred it slowly, watching the dark liquid swirl and lighten into that perfect caramel color. Clara was still standing there, watching me like she couldn't believe I was casually making coffee while our marriage burned down around us. But honestly, what did she expect? Did she think I'd collapse into a sobbing heap on the kitchen floor? That I'd beg her to explain everything and promise to forgive her if she just came clean? I took a sip, perfect temperature, perfect flavor, probably the best coffee I'd made in weeks, and pulled out my phone from my pocket. Clara's eyes widened when she saw it, probably thinking I was about to show her screenshots or evidence or something equally dramatic, but the truth was way better than that. "By the way," I said casually, scrolling through my recent calls, "that buzzing earlier? After I sent you that text? That wasn't all from you." I held up my phone so she could see the screen. "See this call at 2:17? That's my lawyer. Jonathan. Nice guy, went to law school with my buddy Steve, specializes in divorce cases. He's meeting me at 9. Clara's face went through about 17 different shades of white and pale before settling on something that looked like absolute horror. "You called a lawyer before talking to me?" she whispered, and I had to appreciate the audacity of that statement, like I was the one who'd done something wrong by being prepared. "Yep," I said, popping the P for emphasis and taking another sip of my excellent coffee. "I called him right after you started blowing up my phone with all those panic calls I didn't answer. Took me about 30 seconds to find his number and about 2 minutes to explain the situation. You know what he said? He said, 'Good for you for not waiting.' And then he told me to document everything and not let you back in the house. So technically, I'm already failing at following legal advice, but I figured I'd at least let you dig your own grave a little deeper before I completely shut the door on this whole situation." She looked like she was going to faint or throw up, or possibly both at the same time. Her hand reached out for the kitchen counter to steady herself, and I watched with a strange sense of detachment as she processed what I'd just told her. But we haven't even talked about this. We haven't tried to work it out. You can't just give up without even trying." "Can't I, though?" I asked, genuinely curious about her logic here. "You called your boss before talking to me, remember? You made plans to meet up with him at whatever location you were at without consulting me. You decided to have an entire affair without including me in that decision-making process. So why exactly do I need to consult you before deciding that I'm done with this marriage? What? Do I need to file a formal request? Submit it in triplicate? Wait for approval from the Department of Broken Trust?" Clara tried to grab my arm, reaching out with that desperate energy of someone who'd just realized they'd lost control of the entire situation. "Please, Henry, you're not thinking straight. You're angry and you're hurt, and you're not making rational decisions right now." I stepped back before she could touch me, again, because I was not about to let her use physical contact as some kind of emotional manipulation tactic. "No, Clara, I'm thinking perfectly straight for the first time in months. You know when I wasn't thinking straight? When I ignored all those red flags. When I pretended not to notice that you were pulling away. When I convinced myself that you were just stressed from work and that everything was fine. That's when I wasn't thinking straight. Right now? Right now I'm thinking with crystal clarity. And that clarity is telling me that I deserve better than someone who lies to my face and then expects me to stick around for the apology tour." She was full-on sobbing again, that ugly crying that comes with snot and hiccups and gasping breaths. And normally, in any other situation, I would have felt bad. I would have offered her a tissue, maybe a glass of water, some kind of comfort. But standing there in my kitchen at 3 a.m, drinking my perfectly made coffee while she cried about consequences she'd brought on herself, I just felt tired. Not angry anymore, not even particularly hurt, just exhausted by the entire situation. "You don't understand how hard this has been for me," she managed to say through the tears, and wow, that was bold. That was impressively bold. She was really going to try to make herself the victim here? "Hard for you," I repeated, my voice going dangerously quiet. "Let me tell you what's been hard. Hard has been lying in bed every night wondering why my wife doesn't want to touch me anymore. Hard has been watching you get excited about going to work and realizing you've never been that excited about coming home. Hard has been pretending everything is fine while you slowly checked out of this marriage one lie at a time. So forgive me if I don't have a lot of sympathy for how hard it's been for you to juggle a husband and a boyfriend simultaneously." I finished my coffee, still the best cup I'd made in weeks. Honestly, this whole crisis was really bringing out my barista skills, and rinsed the mug in the sink, taking my time with it because I knew it was driving Clara crazy that I was being so calm and methodical about everything. She wanted drama, wanted big emotional reactions, wanted me to either explode in anger or collapse in grief so she could know how to respond. But I wasn't giving her that satisfaction. "So here's how this is going to work," I said, drying my hands on a dish towel and turning to face her with the kind of composure I didn't actually feel but was faking really well. "You're going to leave. You're going to go stay with your mom, or your sister, or hell, go stay with Richard for all I care. I'm sure he's got plenty of room now that he's divorced. And I'm going to meet with Jonathan at 9 o'clock, and we're going to start the paperwork to end this marriage as quickly and cleanly as possible. You'll get your stuff, I'll get mine. We'll divide everything like adults, and then we can both move on with our lives." "I don't want a divorce," she whispered, and I almost laughed at how absurd that statement was coming from someone who'd literally been cheating on me. Well, I didn't want a cheating wife, but we don't always get what we want, do we? I said, life's funny that way. Full of little disappointments and betrayals and moments where you realize that the person you married isn't actually the person standing in front of you anymore. I sipped my coffee dramatically. Okay, it was actually just water at this point since I'd already finished the coffee, but I'd refilled the mug and the dramatic sipping motion still worked, while she sobbed like a malfunctioning sprinkler system that someone had set to the highest pressure setting. The sound was honestly impressive in its intensity, like she was trying to cry out enough tears to fill a small pool, and I wondered briefly if this was genuine emotion or just another performance designed to manipulate me into changing my mind. Either way, it wasn't working. My mind was made up. Jonathan was already aware of the situation and preparing whatever paperwork needed to be prepared, and I was done. Completely, totally, exhaustively done with this entire situation. All I wanted now was for Clara to leave so I could finally get some sleep in my own house without wondering where my wife was or who she was with or what lies she was telling. I thought the drama had peaked. I really did. I genuinely believed that we'd hit maximum chaos levels for one night and that things couldn't possibly get more ridiculous. But then again, I'd also believed my wife was working late and not conducting an affair with her divorced boss. So clearly my judgment about what could and couldn't happen was completely shot. It was around 5 a.m. Yes, we'd been at this for almost 3 hours now, which should tell you everything you need to know about how this night was going. When my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately and dreaded deeply. Margaret, Clara's mother, calling from whatever time zone she was currently residing in with the kind of timing that suggested Clara had absolutely called her the second she'd gotten a moment alone. I stared at the phone for a solid 5 seconds, watching Margaret's name flash on the screen like a warning beacon, and seriously considered not answering. But then I thought, you know what? Why not? Let's make this a full family affair. Let's get everyone involved in this spectacular implosion of my marriage. Maybe we could sell tickets, make it a whole event, get some sponsors involved. The neighbors were already invested. Might as well bring in the extended family too. I hit the answer button and barely got the phone to my ear before Margaret's voice came through. And let me tell you, she did not sound happy. Henry, what is going on? Clara just called me absolutely hysterical, saying you locked her out of the house and won't talk to her. Her voice had that sharp, accusatory edge that mothers get when they think someone has wronged their child, and I could already tell this conversation was going to be a ride. I glanced over at Clara, who was sitting at my kitchen table now, still crying, but in a more subdued way, like she'd finally hit the limit of how many tears a human body could physically produce in one night. She was staring at her phone, probably waiting for her mother to call back with news that she'd successfully guilt-tripped me into taking her back. Poor Clara. She really didn't know her mother as well as she thought she did. Did she also mention the part where she's been having an affair with her boss? I asked, keeping my voice pleasant and conversational, like I was discussing the weather or weekend plans instead of infidelity. Or did she leave that detail out of her hysterical phone call? The silence on the other end of the line was so complete that I actually checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. But no, Margaret was still there, just processing what I'd just told her with what I imagined was the same expression someone would have if you told them their dog had learned to speak French. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she said in a very different tone, "What?" "Yeah," I continued, walking out of the kitchen and into the living room, so I could have this conversation without Clara staring at me like a sad puppy. Turns out those work dinners she's been going to, not actually work dinners, more like romantic dinners, with her married boss. Except he's divorced, so I guess technically it's romantic dinners with her divorced boss, which somehow doesn't make it better even though Clara seemed to think mentioning his marital status would help her case. "Clara." Margaret's voice went sharp enough to cut glass. "Is this true?" I could hear Clara's response from the kitchen. That small, pathetic, it was a mistake, that she'd been recycling all night like it was going to suddenly become more effective through repetition. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Margaret's voice came back on the line, and now she sounded less like an angry mother defending her child, and more like an angry mother who'd just discovered her child had done something monumentally stupid. "Henry, I am so sorry. I had no idea. When did this start? How long has this been going on?" "Honestly, Margaret, your guess is as good as mine," I said, settling onto my couch with the kind of exhaustion that comes from being awake for over 24 hours and dealing with emotional chaos for 3 of them. Based on the timeline I've pieced together from her increasingly terrible lies, I'm guessing at least 6 weeks, maybe longer. Could be months for all I know. She's not exactly being forthcoming with details, and frankly, I don't really care anymore. The when doesn't matter as much as the fact that it happened at all. 6 weeks. Margaret's voice went up about 3 octaves, and I heard some rustling on her end like she was getting out of bed, which she probably was since it was stupid early in the morning. Clara Marie Henderson, you have been lying to your husband for 6 weeks. Clara's full name. Oh man, she was in trouble now. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I remembered the whole cheating thing, and the feeling passed pretty quickly. It wasn't planned, Mom. Clara called out from the kitchen, and I had to hand it to her. She was really committed to that line. If they gave out awards for most consistently used terrible excuse, she'd be a shoo-in for the trophy. Apparently it just happened. I added helpfully into the phone. You know, like how rain just happens, or traffic jams just happen, or how you just accidentally trip and fall into an affair with your boss that lasts for weeks and involves elaborate lies about work emergencies and sick dogs that don't exist. Classic case of things just happening beyond anyone's control. Margaret made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a growl. Henry, I don't even know what to say. I raised her better than this. I know I raised her better than this. You did, I assured her, and I meant it. Margaret wasn't a bad person, and she'd actually been a pretty decent mother-in-law over the years. She baked cookies for every holiday, remembered my birthday, never did that passive-aggressive thing where she criticized Clara through complimenting me. She was genuinely one of the good ones. This isn't on you. Clara's an adult who made adult decisions, and now she gets to deal with adult consequences. That's how life works. What are you going to do? Margaret asked, and I could hear the resignation in her voice, like she already knew the answer but had to ask anyway. I've already called my lawyer, I said flatly. We're meeting at 9. I'm filing for divorce as soon as humanly possible because I'm not interested in dragging this out or trying to work through it, or whatever people are supposed to do when they find out their spouse has been cheating on them. Clara made her choice, and now I'm making mine. Good, Margaret said, and I actually had to pull the phone away from my ear to make sure I'd heard her correctly. Did my mother-in-law just say good? To me divorcing her daughter? I'm sorry, Henry. You deserve better than this. You've always been good to her, always treated her well, and this is how she repays you? By sneaking around with her boss like some kind of, she cut herself off, probably remembering that Clara was still her daughter despite being a terrible wife. Thank you, Margaret, I said, genuinely touched by her response. That actually means a lot. I was kind of expecting you to defend her, or try to convince me to give her another chance, or do the whole marriage is sacred speech. Oh, marriage is sacred, Margaret said firmly. Which is exactly why what she did is so unforgivable. You don't treat sacred things like garbage and then expect them to still work. She broke something that can't be fixed with apologies and tears, and she needs to understand that. Clara, are you listening to me? I heard Clara's muffled, yes, Mom, from the kitchen, and I could picture her sitting there, probably feeling like she was 12 years old again and getting lectured for breaking curfew. Except this time the consequences were slightly more severe than losing her allowance. I want you to go to your sister's house, Margaret continued, her voice taking on that commanding tone that mothers perfect over decades of dealing with children who don't want to do what they're told. Right now? Tonight. This morning. Whatever time it is there. You're going to pack a bag. You're going to leave Henry alone, and you're going to give him the space he clearly needs and deserves. And then you and I are going to have a very long conversation about why you thought destroying your marriage was a good idea. But Mom, Clara started, but Margaret cut her off faster than a knife through butter. No buts. You don't get to, but you're way out of this one. You made your bed, now you get to lie in it. Or rather, you get to lie in your sister's guest room while you figure out what you're going to do with the rest of your life now that you've blown up your marriage for someone who probably isn't even going to stay with you once he realizes you're available and the excitement of sneaking around is gone. Damn, Margaret was absolutely destroying Clara right now, and I was here for every second of it. I'd always liked my mother-in-law, but I was loving her right now. She was saying all the things I'd been thinking but hadn't quite articulated because I was too busy being sarcastic and making coffee. Margaret, I have to say, I interjected, unable to help myself. Thank you for raising a woman who at least feels guilt on command. That's something, I guess. Not enough to save the marriage, but it's a quality that exists. Margaret actually laughed, though it was one of those bitter laughs that people do when something is more sad than funny. Henry, you're a better man than she deserves. You've always been too good for her. I just didn't realize how true that was until right now. I appreciate that, I said sincerely. And I appreciate you not doing the thing where you try to defend her, or make excuses, or blame me for somehow driving her into another man's arms. That's refreshingly honest. There's no excuse for cheating, Margaret said firmly. None. I don't care if you'd been the worst husband in the world, which you weren't. She should have either tried to fix things or left you before starting something with someone else. That's what adults do. That's what people with integrity do. This sneaking around, this lying, this betraying someone who trusted you, that's coward behavior, and I didn't raise a coward. I could hear Clara crying again in the kitchen, harder now, probably because having your own mother's side with your soon-to-be ex-husband was hitting differently than having your husband be angry at you. There was something about parental disappointment that cut deeper than almost anything else, and right now, Margaret was serving it up with the efficiency of someone who'd been perfecting the art of maternal disappointment for decades. She's going to call you back, Margaret said, her voice softening slightly. After she calms down, she's going to try to apologize and explain and make you understand why she did what she did. Don't answer if you don't want to. You don't owe her anything at this point. I wasn't planning on it, I assured her. My lawyer already advised me to limit contact, and honestly, I've heard enough lies and excuses tonight to last me a lifetime. Whatever she has to say, she can say it through her lawyer once she gets one. When we hung up a few minutes later, after Margaret had given me her personal number and told me to call her if I needed anything or if Clara tried to harass me, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. Not just relief that someone was on my side, but relief that I wasn't crazy for thinking this was unforgivable. By the time sunrise rolled around, and yes, I'd been awake for the entire night at this point, running on nothing but coffee, spite, and the righteous indignation of a man who'd been wronged, my front yard had transformed into something that looked less like a peaceful suburban property and more like the staging area for a low-budget reality TV show about family dysfunction. I'm talking cars parked at weird angles all over the street, people I was related to by marriage standing on my lawn looking concerned and confused, and enough dramatic tension in the air to power a small city. It was like someone had sent out an emergency broadcast saying, "Family crisis at Henry's house. All available relatives please report immediately." And everyone had actually shown up. Clara's parents were there, obviously. Margaret looking exhausted but determined, and her dad Robert looking like he wished he was literally anywhere else on planet Earth. Clara's sister Lydia had shown up with her husband Mark, both of them looking like they'd gotten dressed in about 30 seconds and hadn't bothered to check if their clothes matched. And then, because apparently this situation wasn't chaotic enough already, there was Uncle Ray, the forever divorced uncle who showed up to every family gathering with unsolicited advice about relationships despite having failed at every single one of his own. Ray was that relative, you know, the one, who thought his 3 divorces made him an expert on marriage instead of a cautionary tale about making terrible life choices repeatedly. I opened my front door to this absolute circus of concerned family members, and honestly, part of me wanted to just close it again and pretend none of this was happening. But the other part of me, the part that was running on fumes and had completely run out of patience for pretending everything was fine, figured why not let this play out? It was already the worst night of my life. Might as well make it a group activity. "Morning, everyone," I said, leaning against my doorframe with the casual energy of someone who was absolutely dead inside but too stubborn to show it. "Welcome to the Henry and Clara Show, season finale, The Affair Revelation. Please keep your arms and legs inside the vehicle at all times, and remember, there's no refunds on emotional damage." Uncle Ray decided to start things off, because of course he did, stepping forward with that self-important energy that only men who think they're wise despite all evidence to the contrary can pull off. "Marriage takes work, Henry," he began, and I had to physically stop myself from laughing in his face because this man, this thrice-divorced man who currently lived alone in a studio apartment with a cat who barely tolerated him, was about to lecture me about making marriage work. "Yeah, Ray," I said, cutting him off before he could really get going on whatever speech he'd prepared during his drive over. "You're absolutely right. Marriage takes work. But the kind of work marriage needs is stuff like communication and compromise, and maybe couples therapy if things get really rough. Not the kind you do at 2 a.m. with your boss in what I'm assuming was either his car or a cheap motel. That's a different kind of work entirely. And it's not the kind that helps a marriage, it's the kind that ends one. Mark, Lydia's husband, and honestly one of the few people in Clara's family I actually liked, made this choking sound like he was trying not to laugh, covering his mouth with his hand and turning away slightly. I caught his eye, and he gave me this subtle nod that said, "Damn, dude, well played." And I appreciated that more than he probably realized in that moment. Lydia folded her arms, her expression shifting from concerned to absolutely pissed in about half a second. She cheated, Uncle Ray. Stop defending stupidity. And that was why I liked Lydia. She didn't sugarcoat things or try to make excuses for bad behavior just because it came from family. She called it like she saw it, and right now, she was seeing her sister very clearly for the first time. Uncle Ray looked like he'd been slapped, his mouth opening and closing like a fish that had suddenly found itself out of water, trying to come up with some response that would re-establish his authority as the family relationship expert. But before he could formulate whatever nonsense he was planning to say, Mark decided to twist the knife a little deeper. Guess the promotion wasn't the only thing on the table, Mark muttered under his breath, but loud enough that everyone heard it, and I swear to God, even Margaret, who'd been looking generally stern and disappointed, had to turn away to hide what might have been a smile, trying to break through her serious expression. The silence that followed was absolutely golden. That perfect, awkward silence where everyone knows someone just said something savage, but nobody's quite sure if they should acknowledge it or pretend they didn't hear. Clara, who'd been standing off to the side looking like she wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole, turned an even deeper shade of red than I thought was physically possible. Her face went from regular embarrassed pink to full-on fire engine red, and I wondered briefly if she was going to pass out from the sheer humiliation of having her affair discussed in front of her entire family at sunrise in my front yard. "Can we not?" Clara started, her voice small and defeated. But Lydia cut her off with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting years to tell her sister exactly what she thought of her life choices. Not what? Not talk about the fact that you destroyed your marriage? Not mention that you've been lying to everyone for weeks? Not acknowledge that you threw away a good man for someone who probably still thinks Axe body spray is cologne? Lydia was on a roll now, and I was absolutely here for it. I told you that Richard gave off creeper vibes when you first started working there. I told you he was bad news. But you didn't listen because you were too busy being flattered by the attention. He's not a bad man, Clara said quietly, and the moment those words left her mouth, I knew. I just knew that she'd made a catastrophic mistake. You could physically feel the energy in the yard shift, like someone had just flipped a switch that said, "Oh, it's over now." The room, or yard, I guess, since we were outside, froze. And I mean completely froze, like someone had hit pause on reality itself. Margaret's eyes went wide. Robert's face turned red. Lydia's jaw literally dropped open. Mark stopped mid-chuckle. Even Uncle Ray, who'd been trying to formulate some wisdom about forgiveness or second chances or whatever divorced uncles talk about, went completely silent. "Oh, so you're defending your lover now?" I asked, and my voice was so calm, so perfectly level, that it was actually more terrifying than if I'd yelled. "That's the play we're going with here? We're at the, but he's actually a really good guy once you get to know him stage of this disaster? Clara, read the room. Actually, read the yard. Look around at the faces of everyone who drove over here at dawn because they thought you needed support, and tell me if you think defending Richard is really the move right now." Mark couldn't help himself. "Damn, she's still digging," he muttered to Lydia, who was staring at her sister like she'd never seen her before, like Clara had suddenly revealed herself to be an alien wearing a human suit and doing a terrible job of pretending to understand normal human behavior. Even Uncle Ray, the man who'd shown up ready to deliver a speech about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of forgiveness despite having 0 successful marriages in his own history, whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "You're on your own, kid." And that's when I knew I'd won. Not that this was ever really a competition, but in that moment, watching Clara's own family turn on her one by one as they realized she was still defending the guy she'd cheated with instead of showing any real remorse for what she'd done, I realized that I had the moral high ground, the legal high ground, and the family support high ground. I had all the high grounds. I was standing on top of High Ground Mountain, looking down at Clara in the Valley of Terrible Decisions. Robert, who'd been silent this entire time, finally spoke up. Clara, honey, I think you should stop talking now. His voice was gentle but firm, the way fathers talk when they're trying to save their children from themselves. Every word that comes out of your mouth is making this worse. I just meant, Clara tried again, but Margaret cut her off with a hand gesture that had probably been perfected over 3 decades of parenting. We know what you meant, Margaret said coldly. You meant that you've developed feelings for this man, which means this wasn't just a physical affair, it was an emotional one too, which somehow makes it worse, if that's even possible at this point. Lydia turned to me, and her expression was genuinely apologetic. Henry, I am so sorry. I don't know what happened to her. This isn't the sister I grew up with. The Clara I knew would never. She stopped, shaking her head. I'm just sorry. You deserved better than this. Thanks, Lydia, I said, and I meant it. It was weirdly comforting to know that at least some of Clara's family was on my side, or at least on the side of basic human decency and not cheating on your spouse. Mark stepped forward, clapping me on the shoulder in that way guys do when they don't really know what to say, but want to show support anyway. You need anything, man, place to crash, someone to help you move stuff, back up at the lawyer's office, just call. Seriously, I appreciate that, I said, and I did. Mark was good people. Always had been. I made a mental note that in the divorce, I was keeping Mark and Lydia as friends. Clara could have Uncle Ray and his terrible advice. The sun was fully up now, bathing my disaster of a front yard in golden morning light that made everything look way more peaceful than it actually was. Mrs. Henderson was still at her window. I had to give her credit for commitment. And I was pretty sure she was taking notes at this point, probably planning to write a memoir about the most dramatic night in neighborhood history. So here's what's going to happen, I said, addressing the group like I was leading a board meeting instead of managing a family crisis. Clara is going to pack her essentials, and I mean essentials, not half the house. And she's going to stay with either you, Margaret, or you, Lydia, whoever volunteers as tribute. I have a meeting with my lawyer in, I checked my phone, about 3.5 hours, and I'd really like to get a shower and maybe 45 minutes of sleep before I have to deal with paperwork. Any objections? Nobody objected. Even Clara seemed to realize that she'd lost this battle, this war, and probably the next 3 wars after this one. She nodded weakly, looking like she'd aged about 10 years overnight, and started heading toward the house to pack. Watching Clara pack her things was surreal in a way I hadn't expected. This woman who'd shared my life for 8 years was now moving through our bedroom like a stranger, pulling clothes from drawers and hangers with shaking hands while her mother supervised from the doorway, like a prison guard, making sure an inmate didn't try to steal anything on their way out. The whole scene had this weird finality to it, like watching the end credits roll on a movie you'd invested way too much time in only to discover the ending sucked. Can I at least pack some things? Clara had asked earlier, her voice small and defeated, and honestly, I'd almost felt bad for her in that moment. Almost. But then I remembered the lipstick and the lies and the 2:30 in the morning text message, and the sympathy evaporated faster than water on hot pavement. Of course, I'd said, gesturing toward the bedroom like a hotel concierge showing a guest to their room. Take whatever you need. Just not my sanity. That's the one thing you don't get to pack in your suitcase and take with you. She'd try to hug me then. Actually reached out with both arms like we were saying goodbye after a normal visit and not ending our entire marriage. And I stepped back so fast I almost tripped over the coffee table. The look on her face when I avoided her touch was something between hurt and shock, like she genuinely couldn't believe I didn't want her anywhere near me after everything that had happened. Save the affection for your performance reviews, I said. And I heard Mark snort from the living room where he and Lydia were pretending not to listen to every word of this conversation. Now, 45 minutes later, Clara had managed to pack 2 suitcases and a duffel bag with Margaret's help, and honestly, I was impressed by the efficiency. Margaret had clearly taken over the operation, making executive decisions about what was essential and what could be retrieved later, probably because she knew that if she left Clara to her own devices, we'd be here until next Tuesday, while Clara had an emotional breakdown over every item she touched. Lydia had been muttering commentary the entire time from her position in the hallway, little observations like, "You won't need those heels where you're going," and pretty sure Henry paid for that dress. Maybe leave it. Which wasn't technically helpful, but was definitely entertaining. Her sister had zero chill, and I respected that about her immensely. When Clara finally emerged from the bedroom, looking like she'd been through an actual war instead of just packing some clothes, she stopped in front of me one last time. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Her makeup was completely destroyed, and she had that desperate look that people get when they're trying to figure out if there's any possible way to undo what they've done. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and it was probably the most genuine thing she'd said all night. Not the most useful thing, not the thing that would change anything, but at least it sounded like she meant it. I nodded slowly, maintaining eye contact because I wanted her to see that I was completely serious about what I was about to say. Apology accepted. Marriage revoked. It was clean. Simple. Final. 6 words that ended 8 years of history, and honestly, they felt right. No dramatic speeches, no crying, no last-minute pleas for reconciliation. Just a simple acknowledgement that yes, she was sorry, and yes, it was over anyway. Clara opened her mouth like she wanted to say something else. Probably another apology or an explanation or a plea for me to reconsider. But Margaret put a hand on her shoulder and shook her head. Smart woman, Margaret. She knew when a conversation was over, even if her daughter didn't. They filed out of the house one by one. Margaret first with one of the suitcases, then Lydia with the duffel bag, then Clara with the remaining suitcase, looking back over her shoulder every few steps like she expected me to call her back and tell her this was all some kind of test or joke or elaborate prank. Robert followed behind them all, giving me a nod that said more than words could have, and then Mark, who clapped me on the shoulder one more time and said, "You're gonna be fine, man. Better than fine, actually." The door shut behind them with a soft click that sounded way louder than it should have, and suddenly the house was quiet. Not just quiet, silent. The kind of silence that happens when something major ends and you're left standing in the aftermath, trying to figure out what just happened. I stood there in my entryway for a solid minute, just listening to the nothing, feeling the emptiness of a house that had held 2 people for years suddenly adjusting to holding just one. I walked to the window and watched them load Clara's stuff into Margaret's car. Watched Clara get into the back seat like a kid being picked up from a sleepover that had gone badly. Watched the car pull away from my curb and disappear around the corner. And when they were gone, really, truly gone, I felt it. Peace. Actual, genuine peace. The kind I hadn't felt in months, maybe longer. The faint smell of freedom hung in the air, mixing with the lingering scent of coffee from earlier, and I realized something important. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. 3 months later, Karma decided to stop taking its sweet time and finally showed up to work. And let me tell you, when Karma clocks in, it doesn't mess around with subtle life lessons or gentle course corrections. No, Karma went straight for the jugular with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for the perfect moment to absolutely demolish some lives. And I was absolutely here for every single delicious second of it. I found out about the whole thing from Mark, actually, who'd heard it from Lydia, who'd heard it from their cousin Jessica, who worked in the same office building as Clara and had front row seats to the absolute dumpster fire that Clara's professional life had become. Apparently, and this is where it gets really good, Richard, the boss, the divorced guy with the allegedly sick dog, the man who Clara had defended as not a bad man, got fired. Not just fired, but spectacularly, publicly, humiliatingly fired for creating a hostile work environment. Here's the thing though, Richard's wife, the one who Clara claimed was sick except she wasn't actually his wife anymore, turned out to be not quite as ex as everyone thought. Sure, they were divorced on paper, but apparently they'd been trying to work things out, going to couples therapy, the whole 9 yards. And Richard had conveniently forgotten to mention this little detail to Clara during their romantic rendezvous. So when the wife, let's call her Jennifer because that was actually her name, found out about the affair, she didn't just get mad. She got evidence. Jennifer had screenshots, text messages, emails, calendar invites that were definitely not about actual work meetings, expense reports for hotel rooms that Richard had claimed were for client entertainment. She had everything, all compiled into a beautiful folder of receipts that she hand-delivered to HR with the kind of professional thoroughness that suggested she'd been planning this revenge for a while and was savoring every moment of it. HR took one look at that folder, and apparently Richard was escorted out of the building within the hour, his office packed up by security while everyone watched. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. But wait, it gets better. Clara didn't get fired, which honestly might have been more merciful, but she got reassigned. They moved her from her nice office with the window view to a basement desk next to the server room that made this constant humming noise. Her new job responsibilities included refilling printer paper, organizing supply closets, and updating spreadsheets that nobody actually read. Basically, they demoted her to a position that didn't technically exist before they created it specifically to punish her without actually firing her. And the nickname? Oh man, the nickname was just Chef's Kiss Perfect. According to Jessica, Clara's coworkers had started calling her 2 a.m. Clara because apparently word had spread about the circumstances of her affair coming to light. Nothing stays secret in an office environment, especially when the affair involves the boss and ends with him getting publicly fired. People talked, rumors flew, and somehow the detail about the 2:30 in the morning text message had made it into the office gossip circuit. I heard she couldn't walk through the office without people whispering and smirking, couldn't eat lunch in the break room without conversation stopping when she walked in. It was brutal, but also, and I say this with zero guilt, completely deserved. She'd made her choices, and now she got to live with the consequences in the form of eternal office humiliation and a job that made filing papers seem exciting by comparison. The best part? Clara texted me about a month into her new reality. Just one message that appeared on my phone like a ghost from a past life I'd successfully moved on from. I'm in therapy now. I've learned from my mistakes. I stared at that message for about 5 seconds, watching the little dots appear and disappear as she presumably wrote and deleted follow-up messages, trying to figure out what else to say that wouldn't make things worse. Part of me wanted to respond with something cutting, something sarcastic that would let her know exactly how little I cared about her personal growth journey. But then I realized something better. Silence was way more powerful than any response I could craft. I replied with nothing. Didn't even leave her on read. Just never opened the message at all. Let her see that little delivered notification and wonder forever if I'd even bothered to look at it. Let her sit with the uncertainty of not knowing if I'd forgiven her, still hated her, or had simply moved on so completely that she didn't even register as important enough to acknowledge. Silence became my favorite language, especially when it came to Clara. By now, I'd completely turned my life around, and I don't mean that in some vague, inspirational poster kind of way. I mean I'd literally replaced everything that reminded me of Clara. New couch because the old one had too many memories of us watching terrible reality TV together. New bedding because sleeping on the same sheets felt weird. New routine that involved actually going to the gym instead of just thinking about it. My house felt like mine again, not ours, and that difference was more significant than I'd expected. My neighbor Paul stopped by one Saturday afternoon, looking relieved to escape his own house. Lunch. My wife's out of town visiting her sister, and I'm tired of pretending I know how to cook anything that doesn't come with instructions that say microwave for 3 minutes. We hit this burger place downtown that had been there forever, the kind of place with checkered floors and waitresses who called everyone Han and didn't judge you for ordering fries and onion rings. Paul asked the question everyone had been dancing around for months. So, any regrets? I took a bite of my burger, perfectly cooked, extra pickles, the exact kind of simple pleasure I'd been enjoying more lately, and thought about it. Did I regret how I'd handled things? The sarcasm, the cold efficiency, the way I'd shut Clara out completely? Only that I didn't block her sooner, I said, and I meant it. Paul laughed so hard, he almost choked on his drink. You handled that like a legend, man. Seriously, everyone's been talking about it. You're like the neighborhood hero for standing up for yourself. Later that evening, I was grilling on my patio when Margaret called, which surprised me because we hadn't talked much since the divorce was finalized. I just wanted to say thank you, she said, her voice soft. You handled everything with grace. Grace? Margaret, I handled it with sarcasm and good coffee, but close enough. I replied, flipping a burger with probably more confidence than the situation required. She laughed, really laughed, and it was nice to hear. You deserve better, Henry. You always did. When we hung up, I looked around at my quiet yard, at the grill I'd bought myself last month, at the peace I'd built from the wreckage of my marriage. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I was truly content. No drama, No lies, no wondering where my wife was or who she was with. That one text, no need to explain. Stay with your boss, you're single now, wasn't the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of my peace. The beginning of a life where I didn't have to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't, where I could just be myself without worrying about someone else's lies catching up to me. And honestly, I'd never slept better. My bed was mine, my house was mine, my life was mine. And that was worth more than any marriage built on lies could ever be.